when like they're down and being emotional because you're slowing down time so then they can't react.
Okay.
Since they're really emotional, take advantage of it.
Are you in the relationship with them?
You're going after a poltergeist with like separation anxiety. Okay.
I feel bad as a poltergeist. No one voted for us. You're gonna be so sad.
I know. It's just gonna be
Because
the
they
time.
just move things around and can scream.
Is
Poltergeists
this
are basically
yours,
just
Catherine?
ghost toddlers.
Yeah.
That's,
Okay.
yeah.
For study time.
Okay, great.
Alrighty,
Are you recording?
I think.
Is Mike on?
Mic is on.
It was not from Wikipedia, it was from Oxford Languages.
Maybe Wikipedia took it from Oxford language.
Oh, Wikipedia is always right.
Wikipedia is always right. You know, I'm a certified Wikipedia.
How do you become certified in Wikipedia?
Yeah, mine is
I
from Oxford
signed up.
Languages.
Oh. Okay.
How much editing have you done?
Quite a bit. I
It was always from
completely
Oxford
revamped the
Languages.
page for South Dakota Governor Carl Gunderson. It was sort of just, it was messy and did not make, it didn't flow, and so I spent an afternoon and changed it.
Okay, now I'm gonna read it. See
Yeah,
your
it's pretty good.
editing skills.
Yeah, I respect that. I personally would sign up to put incorrect information on pages.
We'll definitely. You would get banned.
That's a menace to society.
Someone would have to like report it.
Guys,
Okay.
I put misinformation.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the consequentialism versus deontology lecture. Ooh, I do have glasses. I am running out of contacts.
You want to make sure you're taking him seriously. I
Yeah.
For sure that was happening yesterday.
Yes, sure. All right, so what we'll cover in this lecture is a value criterion review, what consequentialism and deont is, strategy, general justification, and responses, and then we're going to apply it to the China resolution to better help you guys understand or think of frameworks to use for
Yep.
this topic.
All right, just stay on the slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you who have done a lot of LD, you probably already know what these are. For those of you who are switching events or just starting or don't have a lot of experience, we're going to quickly recap what you do at the top of your case. So you have a value, and you have a criterion. Yes, and you literally say, I value whatever you value, like justice. And then you say my criterion is, however I achieve that value. Can someone explain to me what a value is? Who has done LD?
Candy, question, by the way.
Any question? Jack.
It's the absolute moral bearing in the round. This is what we want to achieve at the end of this round. This is what we have or want to get to.
Yes. Can you also give me an example?
Yeah, you could say I value, thank you, human dignity, where at the end of the round, the last or the most important thing in this round is finding the way that we can get the most human dignity.
Okay, what does human dignity mean?
Is that still to me?
Oh, I can also ask other people. Do you want more candy?
I mean, I can take it. So I, as a human, have a certain dignity to me that, say, if I had a pet pig named Bertha, that pet pig named Bertha wouldn't have that same dignity or worthy of the same respect because it's not a human.
Yes. Very good. Okay. So a lot of things boil down to, like, what do we think is good for people? This is a little bit vague, I think, for people who are just switching to LD. This is the idea that just by nature of being human, you deserve some sort of respect. Some other values you might see are like societal well-being. I'll just write SOC, well-being. Okay. Yes, societal well-being, which is like you want generally most people in society to be living a good life. These are just like, what do you want to happen in the world? And then the criterion is how do we get there? Can someone give me, or explain to me, all right, I literally just explained what a criterion is. Okay, can someone give me an example of a criterion? Dwyer?
Utilitarianism.
Yes. Util. What is util?
It simply means the greatest good for the greatest amount of people.
So true. Okay, greatest good for greatest number of people. So this is like, say we have 100 people and doing one thing will give 80 of them, like, what's something you want? Candy. Oh, wait, what did she say?
McDonald's.
McDonald's, okay. Action 1 gives 8, okay, let's just assume that McDonald's is good. Everyone wants McDonald's. We have 100 people, and we could do one thing that gives them 80 people McDonald's. The other thing only results in 20 people having McDonald's. We would go with the 80 McDonald's. Anyways, so that's like one example. There are also more specific things you can talk about, like what exactly are like problems that you need to solve, or what exactly are things that you should do to make society better. For example, you could talk about, what's an example of this?
I was literally not listening to you.
Okay, we could do like minimizing structural violence. This one's also common. Minimizing structural violence. Can someone explain to me what structural violence is? Yes.
It's like, I didn't really caught that, but it's
Okay.
systems of, I don't know if it's running out.
No, we have like,
We have
these have like 100 in them.
Run out.
We'll get more.
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you sure you don't want the candy?
I'm sure.
You look like you want the candy.
Okay, give it to Kira. I'll steal it from her if I want it.
Okay.
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 So minimizing structural violence is like trying to remove or otherwise combat systems in society that are detrimental towards like specific people. So like
Yes.
policing and legal systems.
Yeah. So I won't write this down, but it's the idea that there's structures, hence the term structural, in society that you want to like get rid of or reform such that they do not harm certain people. So Heidi gave the example of like policing, for example. So the idea is that policing as like a structure is bad because it contributes to violence against like minorities, for example. So I said for example like 3 times in that sentence. But yeah, so you can get more specific with who you're talking about. Some other things are like, what are other consequential frameworks?
Maximizing. Yeah, like maximizing expected well-being, which is kind of.
That's like the same as util. Okay, noticing a trend though, that most of these are like fairly vague. Like you're not like, we want to help specifically like these people in this way. Because if you get too specific, then it's basically just like, vote for me because I said so. Because if my criterion on AF is like, protecting the environment as much as I want, or like protecting the environment, for example, you can run that, but it also is susceptible to arguments that are like, this is unfair because this is literally just an auto win for you. I don't think those arguments are particularly convincing, but you should generally still opt for criteria that are like, that both sides would be able to access somehow, just because judges tend to like that more. Does this make sense to everyone? Okay, yes, cool.
All right. So, how many of you guys have seen this thing?
This is so indie. I don't think,
Yeah.
wow.
Underground philosophical.
Yeah.
So this is the trolley problem, obviously, and it's the moral dilemma of choosing to kill one person to save 5, or letting that one person who wasn't supposed to die live, and 5 people would just die. Interesting.
I think the lever is not screaming. I think this is really indicative of modern society.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt.
Maybe he's not screaming because he's not about to get run over.
Maybe he's not. Well, I would scream if I knew someone else getting run over. Maybe he's a psychopath.
The guy with the lever.
Still doesn't make sense. How did they get on the trolley?
All right, absence of the logistics of how they got there.
Like, he's just standing at the lever. You think that if he was already there, he would have had time to at least like push the guy off the track. Like he's just a little off, and then nobody would have to get run over.
All right. Someone has to get run over.
Okay. Yeah. Let's assume this is that. So, in this situation, how many people would pull the lever to kill the one person to save the 5? Higher. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Literally everyone except 1. Or not to like point you out, but okay. So, do you want to give us your reason for not pulling the lever?
There
Fair enough. Okay, so
Wait, can I?
this is like an example we're going to talk about later of why util is kind of like advantageous, is that a lot of people generally think in a util mindset. But this is also an example of like maximizing benefits, or just so like most people in the room chose the utilitarian option. Heidi, you chose the deont option.
The exception to this though is that there's something unique about this situation that's different from other situations, and that I am not directly putting anyone in harm because people would have like I'm not doing the action of killing someone. It's the trolley that's doing so. So we'll talk about other examples in which people are not always hardwired to think just about saving the most number of lives or thinking consequentially.
All right. Yeah, quick note on framework. We've gone over this many times. You don't need cards. You can use your own analysis. Philosophy is just thoughts. Cards will be helpful, though. All right, so what is consequentialism? It's the idea that the ends justify the means, which means that it evaluates moral dilemmas based on the outcome, or like the costs and benefits. So in the example of the trolley problem, if the outcome was 5 people were saved but 1 person died, that means the benefits of pulling the lever outweighed the costs, and consequentialism would support that action. Yeah. So we went over a couple of frameworks earlier, but common consequential frameworks are based on maximizing a specific benefit, or not necessarily a specific benefit, but like maximizing well-being or maximizing util, or etc. Consequentialism is heavy on impact weighing, so if that's how you like to debate, then you will do well with this framework. The objective of consequentialist frameworks is to sow doubt in opponents' harms and to make your benefits as appealing as possible to the judge. Solvency is also very important because the entire premise of consequentialism is that you're providing some benefit that outweighs whatever harm is caused by your side, either the after or the neg. So if you can't actually prove that the benefits are happening, then you don't have offense under this framework. So with consequentialism, framework isn't necessarily your main focus. You want to extend your contention level offense as much as possible and really weigh with that contention level. Use the complexity of deont frameworks to your advantage. Consequentialist frameworks are a lot easier to understand than deont ones, so judges are more like, they're more inclined to listen to a consequentialist framework, or not necessarily listen to, but believe a consequentialist framework and understand it. You generally don't want to kick a consequentialist framework against a deont one. This is because if you're running this type of framework, it's very hard to link into other frameworks, which is a trade-off we'll get into later in this lecture. You also lack specificity that deont frameworks have, which means that you just like essentially cannot link into your opponent's framework most of the time.
This is a lot of words. What does it mean to link into someone else's framework?
So if your opponent is running a framework of like human dignity and minimizing structural violence, and I'm running justice and maximizing well-being or something, if I can find like linking into the opponent's framework would be accepting the opponent's framework as the framework for the round, so conceding my own framework, and also trying to frame my arguments in a way that supports that framework. So in that example, it's kind of tough, but if my arguments were about like social justice in my net case, it wouldn't be that hard to link into that specific type of framework.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Impact calculus is also very, very important. Again, consequentialism is a weighing type. Like it's very heavy on weighing, so using these metrics are very important. So I'm assuming most of you are familiar with these. We'll go more into them in the next slide, but magnitude, time frame, probability, scope, and long-term / short-term is kind of the idea of what happens in the future and how these impacts affect future generations. So magnitude depicts the severity of the impact. Time frame depicts the time until the impact. Probability depicts the chance of the impact. Scope is how widespread the impact is, or how many people are affected. And long-term, short-term is how the impact affects the future. Can someone tell me the difference between magnitude and scope?
Yes.
Magnitude would be something like death, that's like really like severe, and then scope would be like a large number like that it would affect. You could say like 4 million people is have like a larger.
Sure.
Yes.
So like an example would be like if I had two impacts, like economic recession and extinction, the magnitude of one is definitely greater than the other, but the scope is also different in that example. But if I had economic collapse in one specific country versus extinction of like the globe, the magnitude is like death versus recession, and the scope is the Earth versus a country. Does that make sense? All right. You're also going to need to weigh the metrics themselves, which is called meta weighing. So if you and your opponent are both pretty like good at using impact calculus, then you're going to find scenarios in debate rounds where both of you guys are giving justifications for these 5 metrics, and you're going to need to be able to tell the judge why yours are like greater than the opponent's. So an example of this would be magnitude over time frame, because global warming is an extinction event, so it doesn't necessarily matter when it happens. We still have an obligation to prevent it from happening. We're going to do some examples. Catherine, can you write the 5 on the board?
Yes.
Thank you. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask you for an impact that is one but not the other. So like in the example I gave you, this is heavy magnitude but low time frame. So that's, yeah. All right. Should these relate to the China resolution?
They can, if you want. They can also just not, if you don't want. You think of funny examples.
Yeah.
If you think of an example, you also get candy.
Can someone give me an example with high magnitude but low probability again? I guess that's kind of the same one I get, but
Where?
yeah. Yeah,
So true.
perfect.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. So high. I don't know how I want to write this.
Just do
Nuclear
like,
war.
just do, wait.
I didn't spell it right. There's not a C after the end.
Oh, yeah, I have it over here.
Okay, nuclear war. Probably not actually gonna happen anytime soon.
But if it does, the magnitude is
Guys, that
pretty,
really
pretty
suck
clear.
for us.
Yeah,
Can someone think of another example of something that is one but not the other?
of any of those metrics.
What about something that's really likely to happen, but just doesn't matter? Think about like Jagger. Oh, sorry. We can also do mosquito. Wait, yeah, we'll come back to that.
So everyone's gonna like breathe in air, but it doesn't matter. So like there's a
Yeah.
possibility that everyone's gonna breathe in air.
Breathing. Everyone does this. This isn't bad though. This doesn't really harm people that much. If anything, this is like maybe a good thing. Let's say like breathing in like,
Do you like sunburns?
oh, sunburns is good. Going out in the sun and getting sunburns.
High scope, low magnitude.
Wait. Okay, let's create a scenario for these actually. Going out in the sun is our scenario. Sun. Scenario 1, this leads to nuclear war. Okay. Someone tell me how this can lead to nuclear war. Yes.
A head of a country gets a sunburn and is very mad that he has a sunburn, so now he's gonna nuke the sun.
Yes.
Nice.
Okay. So Pursoon, president of Pursoon Land, gets really angry because he has a sunburn, and he nukes the sun. And then after seeing the nuke, they're like, "Oh my God, he's nuking the sun. We have to nuke him back." Now there's nuclear war going on. That is really terrible. Sun leading to sunburns. This makes more sense because this is actually what happens. Okay. Now this is obviously winning on magnitude, or not magnitude, scope.
And
magnitude.
Yeah.
This is winning on probability. How do we compare these two things?
Why is one metric more important than the other?
Is that a raised hand? Yes.
I guess we could argue that with magnitude, the probability is so unlikely that it leads to like policy paralysis if in the case you're looking at reading. Or you
Yeah.
could just argue that it's like unlikely to happen.
Okay. This is really good. Policy paralysis and also just not happening, not happen.
Yeah.
Okay, can you explain policy paralysis?
Yeah, so policy paralysis occurs when an idea of something happening prevents legislators from passing any meaningful movements because they're so worried about this terrible thing that's going to happen. So for example, like let's say like legislators don't want to pass gun restriction laws because like certain legislators are like, it's going to be so bad because if the government becomes fascist, we're not going to be able to fight back. But that possibility is so low that it like might prevent meaningful protections instead.
That's actually a really good example. So yeah, policy paralysis is like, if we thought like this all the time, where we always prioritize the stuff that would affect the most people and be the most severe, even if it would be really bad if it did happen, if there's like a really, really low chance that it will happen, then we never make meaningful change in society because obviously we can think of like anything bad that is going to happen. So like the sun maybe also leads to, what's another existential impact?
Like
Dinos.
supernova.
Oh. Okay.
Dinos?
Okay, dinos. Going out in the sun, there's like actually there's magic in the world, and you accidentally did a set of actions that triggered a magic ability that caused dinosaurs to come back and kill everyone. Okay, so that's not the best argument, but it has high magnitude and high scope. But if we kept thinking of like different existential impacts, like maybe a more reasonable one is like war leads to climate, or not war. What leads to climate change and nuclear war? I don't know. Like factories lead to climate change and kill everyone, and also nuclear war and kill everyone, and also like a meteor strikes the earth and kills everyone. Like all these are things that would kill everyone. But obviously, if we always tried to be cautious against these things, we would just never do anything. Heidi's example is also really good about gun reform, which is like maybe there's an argument that or like an argument that you hear often is like we should have protection against the government for when they try to come and kill us. In the US, for example, maybe the response is like that's super unlikely, even though if it did happen, it would be really bad. And there are other responses that you can make. But
Another thing like about these metrics is that you don't need to like fit every single one into every single argument. Like if someone asks you like the time frame for nuclear war, chances are like you won't find something that accurately gives that. So don't like try to aim to stack as many impact metrics as you can on each argument because you don't need to.
another thing is like a lot of people try to ask you for numbers. You just like don't need numbers because oftentimes you don't have them. Sometimes you do. Like there are a lot of studies that deal with scope, for example, like poverty affects this many people in China, for example. But when you think of things like time frame, I think actually a lot of climate studies also have time frame. Things like probability, you can just like reason out all of these as in like this is likely to have a higher probability because XYZ reason, or this is likely to affect more people because XYZ reason. Even if you don't have like, I don't know, this will affect 11.2% of people. Like nobody has those numbers on hand with them. So you should always just focus on warranting out or explaining your arguments in order to compare weighing metrics, as opposed to this card says I affect this many people, therefore I win.
Plus, these weighing metrics are mostly used in like rebuttal speeches, so you're not even gonna have the time to like sit there and read a card telling the judge that the probability is 0.376. Like that doesn't matter. Reason out through these metrics, or the ones that you can at least.
We will also talk about weighing like in 2 days. Yes.
Yeah.
When we talk about voters.
All right. Is that good with everyone? Cool. So some general justifications for consequentialism, and we should also write this on the board because.
Wait, does anyone have ideas first?
Oh sure. Yeah.
Guys.
How would you justify consequentialism?
I guess we don't really know the alternative right now, but like why
Yeah.
is it good to look at consequences? I guess like a quick preview of Dayon is like instead of looking at consequences, you just look at the rightness or the wrongness of an action. A common example is like if I kill someone in self-defense, it's okay because I did it in self-defense even though I killed someone. Yes.
Like moral actions with, I don't know how to pronounce it, but with like the other side can be very dependent on how you define them. If you simply look to like if it's helping people, it's an easier way to say like if an action is good.
Yeah, so definitional, like, what do we call that? Definitional clarity, yes.
Just put clarity.
So like a lot of like it's there's much more like hazy, like there's some instances that maybe you should look at on a case-by-case basis, and maybe that's really difficult to use, and it's deontology as like a guiding principle, because there are some instances in which it should not apply. We'll also talk more about this if this is confusing. It's a little bit difficult to think of. But the idea is that, like consequentialism generally is much easier to understand.
Yeah. Any other ideas? Alrighty.
I feel like most people just think this, that you should
Yeah.
have consequences.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. All right. So the first one that we're going to talk about is state actors. Does anyone know what this means?
What is an actor? Not like Zac Efron, like
In terms of the resolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
The actor is the person in the resolution who's doing the thing.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at state actors, it's, because many resolutions take the form of a policy proposal, like a universal jobs guarantee or what have you. So when you look at state actors, states often make decisions based on consequentialist ideas.
Follow up. Who is the actor for the resolution that we have for camp? Yes.
Yes.
People's Republic of China.
Okay. Kira, I think I forgot your last candy. Is that true? Okay, I'm just gonna give you one anyways. Here you go. Here's one, Jack. Okay.
All right. So this consequentialist argument basically was, Jack explained it pretty well. It's the idea that state actors have an obligation to adhere to consequentialist policymaking. This is because like the state doesn't have, one, the time, or two, the means to like implement like thinking to every single policy action. This is also a pretty easy link into policy paralysis, but there's also like the other way around for consequentialism that we'll get into. Another.
Oh yeah.
Well, you can go.
This is also just how states have to do things. Like they are constrained by political processes in which they have to yes or no bills, and you aggregate consequences anyways in order to evaluate whether or not like a bill is good.
Yeah. The next justification is fundamental calculus. This is the idea that moral calculus devolves into util anyways when trying to like analyze if anything, like if something is a moral good in and of itself. This shouldn't be a problem if you run down correctly, but it's still an argument that has like some merit in terms of justifying consequentialism.
Why do things devolve to util?
Like, you should answer that.
Okay. The reason people give is that the only way that we can justify principles, so the idea that we should protect the right to like act in self-defense, etc., is because we recognize that there is some external good that we are producing. So in that case, the idea is that you get to maybe someone was going to die in that situation, and you protected yourself. So maybe there is some consequential reason why self-defense would be good. So everything comes back to consequentialism anyways. So does that make sense? Okay.
The third justification is that pain and pleasure are the only universal like truths. An example of this is like justice is subjective for anyone, like whoever, like anyone can think of their specific view on justice, but pain and pleasure are two like specific like emotions that every human can understand fundamentally as one being bad and one being good. So this is a really good justification in terms of saying like the criterion should ideally be as like, what's a good way to say it? Like if these two are universal, then it means that like it's the most.
Like it's not subject to like subjectivity. So
Yeah.
you don't have people disagreeing on what justice is, for example, because pain and pleasure are like biologically like hardwired into you as things that are good, things that make you feel good, and things that make you feel bad.
Yeah.
Can
So we're gonna
anyone-
respond to these.
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that.
So, anyone want to start off with clarity? Or I guess with these three. But
Are we doing state actor?
yes.
Okay, so state actor was the argument that looking at consequences is good because it's how states or countries make decisions. How can we respond to that? Is your hand up, Jagger, or is it?
Well, I was gonna say,
Yeah, so this is kind of an is-ought fallacy, which is the idea that just because this is how a state works does not mean it is how a state should work. Like, even if it would require, like, a complete overhaul of how governments work in order to consider, like, different, in order to consider things that aren't just consequences, then that would still be the more moral action. Like, maybe this isn't a justification as to why it's more moral, maybe it's just a justification for why it's more practical. Okay. Any other thoughts on state actor? Oh, also Jagger candy.
That was pretty accurate.
Yeah, that was
You guys should also like, kind of a hint, I guess. Think about like, why does it matter, like, to follow what the actor says in the resolution?
Not every actor is very good. Like there's examples of China doing horrible things, so they aren't always the most just.
Yeah,
Sure,
so maybe
yeah.
we shouldn't defer to how countries make decisions
Mhm.
if countries aren't even good at making decisions in the first place. Also, is this argument even true? Like, do states always make consequential decisions? No. What's an example of when they haven't? Yeah.
Japanese and Chinese camps, that wasn't a large benefit for a lot of people.
Okay. I think that's definitely true, but I think the way that the state justified it was on consequential grounds. Like, they were like, this would be really good for security. So what's an example of something where the state did something that didn't rely on consequences, and they also did not intend it to have any, like, consequential result? There's one that just happened.
Think. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
I was thinking it.
Okay.
Everybody's thinking it, nobody's saying it.
We could talk about that. Are we gonna talk about that or something else? I don't know.
We can talk about it.
We can talk. I don't know. It's relevant.
Yeah.
So Roe v. Wade, overturning it is not something that was justified on consequential grounds. It related to like, it was a lot of it was like related to both moral grounds and constitutional grounds, which are neither things that are consequential. Another thing is like the Bill of Rights, like the freedom of association, the freedom to like, the right to bear arms, freedom of religion, stuff like that. All of those things were created not because they had to produce better consequences, but because we thought that people ought to have freedom to do things, right? Even if those things would be bad. For example, like if you have like hate speech, for example, this is something that is not illegal to say, even though hate speech probably produces bad consequences, because we still recognize that if we try to prevent like the fringe instances of free speech happening, like if we were like, okay, we should have free speech like most of the time except for when it's bad, then it becomes very blurry to explain when it is actually going to be bad. So we just generally protect free speech always, except for like a couple of like exceptions that we like ruled in the past. So the Bill of Rights is an example of when governments have implemented things that do not rely on consequences. Generally judicial decisions, like whenever the SCOTUS does something, it's also not consequential because it's just relying on interpreting the Constitution.
Right. That makes sense. Any questions? Fundamental calculus. Any ideas how to respond to this one?
This was the idea that everything comes back to consequences anyways, because we don't have like moral rights and wrongs without thinking that like following these moral rights and wrongs will produce something good. This one's kind of tough.
Yeah, this one's a bit weird.
Toughy. No thoughts, anyone? Jagger.
But what's his name? Kant saying that like that, how you do it is what matters, not what you do.
exactly is. But how does that address the idea that, like, maybe the reason why Kant thought that how you do something matters is only because if everyone followed those things, it would be a better society than if they didn't?
I would just say that the means you do something is also important in the fact that like it could greatly harm people. Like for example, on the space topic, like Jeffrey Bezos greatly abuses his like workers in order to get out like space products on time to complete with Elon Musk. Even if he creates like these cool products where they just spend slightly less money, it wouldn't necessarily be justified if that requires like sacrificing people's well-being and lives to do so. So the means would still be like a factor to consider because they still have an effect.
Yeah. So there are instances like it's sometimes hard to justify, but there are things that you can think of like that where you're like, this is obviously just like wrong. Like we probably shouldn't do this to people. That one also I think though has some consequential justification. So I could be like, the harm that you are putting on these workers is worse than the benefit you get from like producing more. And so that doesn't like rule out consequences entirely. Something that you could think of is like, how do I know whether a consequence is good or bad? Were you raising your hand or no? Okay. We talked about pain and pleasure earlier, and maybe this is also a response to pain and pleasure, but why is just thinking about pain and pleasure bad? Yep.
So, I don't really know how to word this, but basically some pain, like, okay, so some pleasure isn't good pleasure, or like some pain isn't, or
Bad pain.
yeah.
Yeah. What are, yeah, do you have any examples?
If you're really hardworking and you have to like struggle to get ends meet, like that might not be a bad thing. Or like bad pleasure would be like serial killers wanting to kill people for fun.
Yeah.
I would say an example I can think of is that like in a lot of underdeveloped countries, like companies like Nike will pay them like fairly living wages, but they're fine with it because they make more than they would make without the company, despite it being like 10 cents a day. It's not, even if they're like happy with it, we can still generally look at it and be like, well, you should probably pay your workers more.
Yeah, so that's a good example. So ideas that maybe I'm in situations where if I were someone else, I would be like, this is terrible. But I'm like, hey, I'm happy right now because at least I'm getting paid some. That doesn't necessarily mean that the thing that is happening is good. An idea of pain that's like maybe not bad is the idea of like protesting. For example, there are people who put their lives on the line for like causes or whatever, which we think is virtuous, even though it would probably be painful for that individual to risk getting like, I don't know, beat up by cops or something. And so there are things that we value, like autonomy, which is generally why people protest, they want more freedoms, or things that we value like that we want to get rid of, like rights violations, where even people who are happy in countries where there are rights violations, we still want to resolve those issues. So yes.
Yeah. All right, that kind of takes out pain and pleasure as well. So, does everyone understand that argument? That's a very good one. All right.
What is deont or deontology? Okay, so we kind of just talked about this. It's the idea that you focus on means, not ends. We talked about rights, so like freedom of association, freedom of speech, stuff like that, which are deontological. Can anyone give me other examples? And they can also be like, yeah, just can anyone give me other examples? Yeah. Of what? Something that is like focuses on means and not ends. So something that can produce things that are bad consequences, but is still good to protect. Prosecuting criminals, like. Yeah, like procedural justice in the criminal justice system. Yeah, that's a good example. So the idea that people should serve sentences because they did the crime There are other reasons why the criminal justice system exists, maybe to protect society, but I think the first and foremost one is like the reason why we give people different sentences as opposed to just like putting everyone in prison for the rest of their lives, because that would obviously protect society the most, is because we recognize that there should be some sort of due process in how you are sentenced. Did someone over here have an example? Yeah.
I was going to say, like, freedom of speech, how, like, it's good for everyone to be able to speak their mind, but however, like, when we were talking about earlier, it could lead to hate speech and harms for other people, like defamation or and even violence.
Yeah, so we protect freedom of speech, even though, like, you can, like, bully people or, like, say things that are, like, really bad. We still protect it. Okay, there are also, and
I would say like another example would be like LGBT people like marching for their lives. Like often that'll inspire like governors and legislators to pass legislation against them. But like the fact that they're still making like a movement and an idea to like bring up their voice, I think would be positive, even if it doesn't give them good results.
yeah, that's a really good example. So ideas of people protesting when the government is going to probably like possibly make conditions worse for them by like via like backlash, or they just are like, we want to, I don't know, maybe like suppress protesting. We want to implement like worse legislation for you guys because you're causing us such big of a problem. But we would obviously not say that communities should not be able to protest because then other people are going to oppress them harder. Like they should still have that right to do so based on them being like at the bottom of the power hierarchy. Some other things you can think about are also just things in your daily life that you probably take for granted a lot, which is like most deontological frameworks come back to this idea of freedom or autonomy. Some other ones also come back to this idea of how you perceive people and whether or not they are respected, but usually they relate to autonomy. So for example, if there were a world where like maybe the government could ration everybody like the healthiest food and they have the resources to do so, and now everyone like lives a really healthy life, you still have, most people would be like, I don't want that to happen because I want to be able to do things like eat pizza, and you think that you should like protect your ability to like eat unhealthily even if generally your health outcomes are going to be worse. So things that the way we move throughout life is built upon a lot of deontological justifications already. Okay, what else is on this slide? Deontological frameworks are usually yes/no questions. So are we protecting something or are we not protecting something? I think the way that this is often run in debate is people will read a framework that's like, we should like protect our like this right or whatever, and then the case is not that. Or like they end up by the end of the like 2AR, the 2NR, they end up just talking about consequences anyways because it's just the easier thing to talk about. But the way that you should run a deontological framework is that you justify a rule. So why is it that we should have freedom of speech? Why is it that we should have the right to protest? And then if the resolution passes the rule, then you vote for your side. An example of that you can run on this topic, and we'll also talk about this later, is this idea of like maybe environmental justice. Like maybe China, due to the fact that it has contributed so much to climate change, owes an obligation to the rest of the world that they should try to do as much as possible to like combat climate change because it's affected everyone else, even if that hurts a lot of people in the short run or even the long run, because climate change is maybe like the basis of why we have rights in the first place. Like maybe you need resources in order to have rights, like your right to like a safe place to live or something. So that would be an example of that. Yeah, so, okay, yeah, come stay on this slide. Okay, yeah, so common deontological frameworks are about rights. So your right to do something, protest, speech, your right to a good environment, your right to live somewhere, stuff like that. So anything that evaluates the intrinsic moral worth or intention of an action, for example, even if something is really resource intensive, we would say that maybe you should still pursue giving everybody housing because it's like a right. There's also maybe consequential justifications there, but the idea is that these are things that people are due just because of the fact that they are human. To be clear, if you are running a deontological framework, you do not care about consequences. this is the problem that I think a lot of debaters run into. You don't weigh against anything because there's nothing to weigh. Like, it does not matter. Like, the only thing is this litmus test that you've set up. Like, does this pass the rule? Does this guarantee the right, or does it not? Before any consequence actually occurs. And then if it does, you vote for your side. That being said, though, deontological frameworks can be justified as necessary prerequisites to certain consequences. So the idea that so the idea of like a freedom to protest, for example, it can be justified on consequential grounds. Like maybe we need the freedom of protest because otherwise there's no other way to hold our government accountable. But if the consequence is that every time you protest, the government just does worse things anyways, so the government is not being held accountable, it is still justified because if you did not have the freedom of protest, there would be literally no opportunity to anyways. This is the only thing that gives you even like a chance of opportunity. So it is a necessary prerequisite for the government to be held accountable, even if in practice it doesn't actually do that. Does this make sense? Okay. Yes. Strategy. Okay, so we talked about the trolley problem. Everyone on the trolley problem, not everyone, but like most people generally default to the idea that you should pull the lever and kill the one person to save 5. Okay, has anyone heard of the organ transplant doctor problem? Yes.
It's when, like, an example is like a person walks in, 5 people need organs, and you as the doctor have to kill the person and harvest their organs to put it into the 5 people, saving them, or you don't, and they die.
Okay.
It's like the trolley problem.
Wait,
The-
and the 5 people die.
Yeah, so yeah, you have to kill someone. So there's a healthy dude, you're a doctor, there's 5 people who are about to die. This guy has all the organs those 5 people need to survive. To save the 5 people, you literally kill this guy and then transfer their organs to the other people. And there's like you don't get prosecuted for this, like you can just do this. Who would kill the person?
Okay, question.
Yes.
Do they need a gallbladder transplant?
Or this is just a picture of dancing organs.
A bladder transplant.
I don't know, I couldn't find a picture online of someone killing someone and harvesting their organs. I thought that was too graphic, so I put these happy organs instead.
Organs would even match up to the person. Like,
Okay.
they don't
Okay, the logistics all work out. Like this works out perfectly.
They all have the same blood type.
Yes, it's crazy. They're all
The doctor's so good he makes it work.
yeah.
Ideally, I'd be like, cool, I want to save people. I don't think I can kill someone, though.
Yeah.
Actuality.
I mean, you don't gotta butcher them. You
I
can
think
just
I'd
hit them with
be
the sedative.
traumatized for the rest of my life.
Okay.
It'd be real nice, you know, you sedate them, you put them to bed.
Okay.
torture and ask what their favorite song is and just loop it until they die.
Okay.
You can't inject them because doesn't that roll the organs?
Oh, that's true.
Okay.
You can still have the jazz.
So you have to kill a guy who's otherwise healthy, who probably does not want to die, like he does not consent to getting killed and having his organs transplanted.
If he's okay with it.
He's not okay with it. He's about to die. You're literally about to kill him. Okay. Who would do it? Okay. So we see much fewer people agreeing to be able to kill the person to save 5 other people, even though technically in terms of lives that are being saved, it's the exact same as the trolley problem. So what is the moral difference between these two scenarios?
You're more in charge of it.
Yes. So in one, you're doing the act of killing, and maybe this is a justification for deontology in that if you intend to harm someone, maybe that is, or if you like intend to be the one harming someone, maybe that is something that should stop you from doing something, even though it produces better consequences. Like if we could protect society by like horrendously torturing one individual, like most people would be like, let's maybe not do that. Any other reasons why these two things are different? Yeah?
Because, like, if you, I'm assuming, like, this would be in, like, hospital or thing, or something, the person coming in has no reason to think they are in any danger at all, whereas there is more sense of, like, fear and danger in the trolley problem.
Yeah. So this guy is, like the guy in the trolley problem on the top track, is technically totally okay if you let it run over the 5 people, but also he's in a position where he could like very well be endangered, and it would not like be irrational or not make sense for him to be in that danger. In this scenario, you have a guy who's like healthy, didn't do anything, isn't in a position of danger, and you're like actively making the decision to kill him. So that's another difference. Are there any other differences we can think of? This is also kind of hard to think of, which is why philosophy is fun. These are interesting problems. 2 other things we can talk about are one, one is who you are in these 2 scenarios. How does that make a difference? Yep.
The guy in the trolley problem's just some guy. He doesn't have any particular oath or obligation to any of those people, but the doctor has taken an oath to save people. Killing a person, mercilessly slaughtering them for their organs seems to violate some sort of oath or some sort of moral code that they have as a doctor to protect people.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good answer. So this guy's just a bystander. He's a random dude who sees this trolley like on the path to kill people. If you are a doctor, you have entered into like a contract, not like a literal contract, but like a contract in terms of you have an obligation to your patient where you are supposed to protect them. This means that the other people were going to die of natural causes, so you had no part in like their death. You did as much as you could. The other guy is like completely fine. So if you make the decision to like ruthlessly murder him, then you have violated that contract to your patient because you did not like respect the obligation you had to him to protect your health. There's also a question of like, sorry. Hippocratic oath? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. Another thing. Oh.
I also think it has something to do with that, like, I guess that there's more behind, like, the doctor situation, because, like, in the original one, I know I've seen, like, the trolley problem, I've seen variations where it's, like, all old people at the bottom and a young person, but it's just, like, 1 versus 5, so it feels, like, less of, like, a, I guess, like, dehumanistic, like, terrible thing to do when it's just, like, kill 5 people or kill 1.
Yeah, so this is another thing that a lot of people running consequentialism will do, is that they will reduce a lot of things down to numbers. Behind all those numbers are like people who exist. They're like, I don't know, you and me. So deontology usually benefits from being very illustrative in terms of talking about the people who you are affecting, or talking about the people that you want to have rights. Another thing we can talk about is like maybe what happens in these scenarios after the people die. Like this guy's just gone. This dude's getting his organs, so like literal parts of himself, transferred to other people, which is like without his consent, which is like low-key pretty weird. So maybe there's a difference in terms of how much these people are giving up of themselves in either world. And maybe we think that you have a right after you die to have some sort of like, to not have your like body mangled or your body like dismembered and given out to other people. Yep.
So when does like consequentialism like outweigh deontology in terms of like sheer number of people versus like their lives, if that makes sense?
Okay, here's the thing. Deontology always comes first if you win it. Like if you're like rights violations are always worse than the consequence, but you have to win that the rights violation matters in the first place, or why it is important that you have to protect the rights violation. So this is where it's like where the framework debate becomes important, because the idea is that someone is going to win the framework and then everything else in the round is evaluated through that framework. If you win your framework that rights are good and you should protect them, then consequences automatically like do not matter. So there's no weighing involved because you just lost your framework. You can't weigh any of your contentions anymore. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Any thoughts on this? Does this start to make sense to people? Okay. Some strategic considerations. If you're good at framework, you just win the round. Like, it's much harder for your opponent to come up with deontological justifications for their consequential case. So, because it's like way harder to think of like while you're just in the round. versus if you're talking about like the economy or climate change generally, most people will have like an understanding of what that is and they can just generate responses anyways if you are running a consequential framework. Another thing is that if you can defend your framework well, you just like don't have to win consequences. So if you don't want to do any of this and make your life easier and just do a lot of prep and like making sure that you are very confident in your framework in advance, then if you rely on your framework to win you rounds, then you like quite literally just do not have to talk about any of these other things that are happening that your opponent brings up. You can also be like super like totalizing with this. You could be like, actually nothing my opponent has said matters like at all at the end of this debate because I just won the framework. So you end up like having less to maybe strategize about if you are only thinking about framework. The downfall of this though is that deontological, or no, this is not a downfall, but it's kind of a downfall because they're hard to understand. So sometimes like judges are not as receptive to them. I think that if you explain them in a way that is understandable, because hopefully people understood what I'm talking about, then it ends up being fine. Yep.
Would you say by South Dakota circuit standards that this would be like a bad idea to run, or do you think it's just how you run?
I actually think this is a good idea to run in South Dakota. I don't think anyone in South Dakota particularly runs it well. I feel like most people end up just like doing consequences anyways, and like not saying that consequences don't matter because we're not wired to think that way. But like if you can explain it in a way that's like consequences literally do not matter via all of the like reasons that I just gave you in the past like 10 minutes, then I think it is strategic. Like Carrie Kondo loves this because it's like an old school LD case, stuff like that. Yeah, and I'll give you an example of like like a deontological case that I ran in my debate career. So we can talk about like maybe justifying a principled argument. But the upside to deontological justifications being hard to understand is that people can't really respond to them very well. Like, because you can't just follow the consequences and be like, oh, well, the consequence of doing this framework would be bad because the framework isn't about consequences. Yeah, and also the frameworks that you are going to be hitting if you are running a deontological framework and you hit someone who runs a consequentialist framework are going to be significantly less justified because most people are probably assuming that they don't need to justify consequential frameworks to the extent that Prasoon explained. Like usually if you've done LD and you're running like util, you aren't like clarity, state actor, fundamental calculus, pain and pleasure, like 5 different justifications because you probably are like 90% of the rounds I'm going into, 95%, are going to be consequential anyways. So I don't need to explain why general consequentialism is good right now. So your framework is probably going to be the better justified one in the round. If you're not good at framework though, well, maybe don't do this. You have less avenues to win on. So the thing about this is that it's very all in. So like if you don't win your framework, it's much harder to win the round because ideally your case is set up such that your contentions are just like, why do I protect the right? Or why does this like meet this principle that I've set up, as opposed to this causes good consequences. So you don't have things built into your case explaining why you are winning consequences yet. So you'd have to rely on like turns and things to win the round, which is why if you are like don't understand your framework, you should probably not run it. But that being said, the avenue you do have to win the round is very strong because it excludes everything else from the debate, and debates become much clearer and a lot less messy. There are probably a lot of debates you've had when you were doing like consequential weighing, where you talk about magnitude, time frame, probability, or whatever, where you like lose and you're like, why did I lose? Because like a lot of the times it becomes very unclear who is winning what in a consequential round. It becomes very clear if you are winning framework that you do win the round if you're running a deontological one. Yeah. Another downfall, though, is that because I just explained that deontological justifications require a lot of warrants and require you to like know what you are talking about, they are also sometimes difficult to explain well. If you're reading like really dense theory, for example, and you're telling like, I don't know, like, I was gonna name drop a judge, but I think most judges are actually competent. But like if you're explaining it to a judge and you're using like words that are over 10 letters long, like in every single sentence, like there's a good chance they're going to stop following you. So basically, just know your theory. If you want to run a deontological framework, know it well, be able to explain it such that someone who's like maybe like familiar with philosophy but doesn't know everything about it can understand what you are talking about, and then you will be fine.
Wait, who's the judge who like stops flowing if you speak faster than like this pace?
Oh, I know who you're
Baumeister?
talking about. No, not Baumeister. Anyways, we're not gonna name drop. No. Judges, we love judges. Judges, having more judges is good, even if they are bad judges.
The thing to like keep in mind about Deont frameworks though is like, I've been on like the other end when I'm running consequentialism and my opponent's running Deont, and I've just like said dumb things like, consequences matter. Like they're not looking at things. They're bad. And judges just voted on it. So some judges in South Dakota definitely care about like solvency and consequences. So take that into consideration when you're running these frameworks.
I think most of them will listen to this though.
Yeah.
I think some of them won't. Presumably you'll have circuit knowledge. If you're not from South Dakota, this is also up to you. I think it depends on your circuit. Also, like if you want to run it, I would like honestly just say run it. Like maybe it will be harder for you to win, but I enjoy having debates where I like what I'm talking about. Okay. Yeah. Here's some justifications for deontology generally. By the way, quick note that we haven't mentioned yet. These are just general categories of like philosophy, right? So like your criterion does not, it can be, but your criterion does not have to be like literally consequentialism or deontology. It optimally should be something a little bit more specific than that. Like what consequences are we focusing on? Are we focusing on like, I don't know, like the most marginalized in society and their consequences, something like that? If we're talking about deontology, what right exactly are we protecting? So there are like, these are like what the general philosophical like category is called, and then it has a bunch of subgroups, and that's where you should like select a criterion from. Also, some verbs that are related to both of them, before I forget to talk about this, is like things that talk about like changes are related to consequentialism. So if you have minimizing something, then you are trying to like reduce something, right? So something's going down. This is like consequentialist. Consequentialist. If you're maximizing something, similar deal. Deontological words are like respecting. So if I respect someone, I mean, they're not, like nothing's happening materially in their life, but it's still good to respect people. So like respecting like rights or whatever would be a deontological criterion. Another one would be, I had another idea in my mind, but I forgot what it was. Oh, recognizing, like if you recognize something, it's the same idea. Also like resisting. Some of these are like kind of vague and can be applied to both, but these are generally like verbs that go with different criterions or criteria, and then you just insert what you are trying to minimize, maximize, respect, recognize, or resist after the verb. Okay, here are some reasons why deontology is good. I probably should have had you guys do this, but the slide is already up. Okay, so most justifications come from human dignity anyway. Like, why do we even care? Like, okay, let's say it is true that pain and pleasure are like the only things that people agree on are good and bad. Why do we even care about protecting pleasure? Like, why couldn't I just like make everyone's lives really painful? Like, why does it matter? Yeah, we think that humans should live good lives. So like everything boils down to things we think that humans deserve. And this is at its core something that is like somewhat deontological. So maybe the idea is that we just deserve respect because we're human, and everything else branches out from this. This is the basic premise of any framework that you're going to run. This is like why ethics exists, because we're debating on what humans are due, which is in its core something that is not necessarily consequential. Yeah, so there are also reasons why consequentialism can be bad. One is like we can't predict consequences super accurately. I mean, on this topic, you kind of can, because it's like economic growth and climate change, but there are examples of topics where you might be talking about a technology that doesn't exist yet, or you might be talking about a war that may or may not happen. If we can't predict consequences accurately, then evaluating them just like doesn't really make sense. And also we can't consider every consequence. So we can give a bunch of reasons. For example, over here, oh, it's erased, just kidding. Where so one thing leads to another, and it branches out in every direction. And these don't even have to be things like nuclear war or like everyone dies, but just everything has a direct consequence and maybe indirect consequences that produce many different things. And in no round are you going to be able to evaluate everything and aggregate everything and weigh everything to like, I also erased the weighing, and you're just not going to be able to weigh literally everything that happens. So every consequential decision you make is going to be inaccurate. Yeah?
One thing that I've encountered a lot, like from util is the utility monster. What would you argue against that?
Is the utility monster? It's like the
It's
like the.
you're sacrificing the minority for the majority. I think that's what I
The utility monster is like this idea that, okay, if like maximizing utility is like the most important thing, then let's say there's someone who knows how to like use like the resources that everyone has the most effectively and apply to the rest of everyone. So in theory, utility would justify having everyone give all their material resources to that person.
Just be like, this just wouldn't happen. Like maybe like this, like.
lost rounds on that though. I feel like this doesn't exist, especially within like my scenario in which I just say like.
The thing with hypotheticals is they're supposed to test your framework in the abstract, but you just be like, testing my framework in the abstract is bad. Like, when is a time when consequentialism has happened and it's hypotheticals like just don't happen, and because they don't happen, they can distract from meaningful change. And I think that's an answer to that.
Normally it's like way better to give hypotheticals if it relates to the resolution somehow.
Yeah. The ones that are really abstract are like, yeah. As for the sacrificing the minority in favor of the majority argument, which is like a common answer to consequentialism, this is like low-key not true sometimes. What's an example of this where you like
I've only heard vacuum scenarios.
vacuum scenarios?
Yeah, like that don't actually exist.
Okay.
I would say that, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I would say that in the situation where like the severity of the suffering for a minority outweighs like marginal benefits for the wider population, that's what justified.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to defend consequentialism and someone was like, well, this allows you to do like segregation, like that's not necessarily true. Like even though like white people are the majority, like that doesn't mean that the weighing becomes, because white people outnumber black people, that means that segregation is good. Like this, you also weigh the severity of the impact to the people who are suffering. Does that make sense? Yep.
And like also with like until who doesn't like not everything is like if it's like the greatest good or utility, the greatest good, like it doesn't automatically mean that just because something's in the majority doesn't mean that you can't expand the good to everyone.
Yeah.
Like the scenarios where it's like 51-49 are like never gonna happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so what's the difference between real and factors then? Because I feel like I've heard something about that.
Sam?
Okay, so I know rule util better, and okay, rule util is weird because, okay, act util is, I think, basically, like, util. Rule util is saying that, like, okay, normally we should seek to maximize utility, but here's some certain rules where that's not true, or, like, where there's some type of, like, overriding right. Basically, it tries to combine, like, deontology with consequentialism and says that, like, utilitarianism is normally the way we should go, but here's some like specific rules in place that overrides utilitarian thinking.
Real. Okay. Also, if we can't answer certain questions, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy can.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay, so is there any way to like completely objectively like map out the impacts of like a consequentialism framework like at all then? Because like
Well, okay, no, this is like what you would say if you were like defending deontology. You'd be like, you like literally just can't. You're always like biased in the way you are evaluating consequences. If you're a consequentialist, you'd be like, no, I am picking the correct consequences. This is true. Like, I don't know.
Like,
These are the biggest
argument
things.
is that you're not able to find any like consequences. It's that like those consequences are incorrect.
Like there's so many consequences, or we don't know enough about the consequences to evaluate them well. Okay. Oh, I haven't said the rest of the slide. Okay. Yeah. Okay, this is the argument that we were just talking about that Heidi kind of like debunked, but it's the idea that not deontology. Consequentialism can justify minority rights violations. Maybe not true all the time though, because of the idea that you can also focus on things like severity and it's not just a numbers game, but this is also a common response to consequentialism that you can make. Another one is like principles guide what counts as like a good or bad consequence in the first place. So this is the idea of pain and pleasure. Like just saying that pain makes people feel bad and pleasure makes people feel good has not explained to me yet why we care that people feel good. Like consequences, evaluating whether a consequence is good or bad is dependent on some sort of rule that I've set earlier or guiding principle that tells me what is good and what is bad. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Also subjectivity, which is the last thing. Like deontology is always like usually a hard rule or a hard principle. Like you have to protect freedom of speech. You have to do this one thing versus consequentialism. A lot of the time it's like, this doesn't really tell me exactly what consequences are good or bad. Yeah. Okay. Some non-strategic considerations you can have for deontology is that it's fun. Aren't you tired of hearing my criterion is util? I am. Okay, anyways. Yeah. Now we're going to talk about trade-offs between the two categories. Us? Okay.
We together. All right, so we kind of like already touched on these a lot throughout this lecture, but we're gonna go over them again. So consequentialist frameworks are easily like the most prepped out frameworks. If any of you guys have ran util, you probably have encountered like a 5-point util block because it's very common to find arguments against util or consequentialism in general. The specificity of deont tends to act like a smokescreen against this, so it's really hard to say 5 reasons for why I shouldn't respect human dignity or I shouldn't like take it into consideration. It's much easier to find 5 reasons for why looking at the costs over benefits might be harmful. So deont definitely has an advantage in terms of like it makes your framework much harder to respond to, which is definitely very beneficial, especially if you're on the AF. Like when we talked about case structure yesterday, you want to have arguments that are hard to respond to so that the neg can't just throw general arguments at all of your subpoints and drown you in a bunch of it's called spreading. They can't just like spread you out. Consequentialism tends to be fairly easy to understand and thus refute. That's just on the other side of it. And consequentialism requires less warranting, so you can focus on contentions. This is kind of a positive trade-off and a negative trade-off. It means that your framework will be much weaker than the affirmatives deont framework, assuming AF goes deont. But it also means your contention level will be a lot more persuasive to the judge and your arguments will be a lot more fleshed out. And you'll have the impact metrics that you can use, which are always a good way to give the judge reasons to vote for you. Additionally, we talked about this a lot, but most people default to a consequentialist mindset. So like the judge in the back of the room will mostly be thinking about what's happening in terms of benefits and what's happening in terms of cost, because that's just how most of us are wired. And that's why most rounds where people run deont, they kind of just revert to, like Catherine said, they just revert to consequentialism because it's easier and it's how most people think in the first place in terms of like justifying arguments. Consequentialism is very easy to link into for the opponent, and it's very hard for a consequentialist to link into a deont framework. This means that it's not like your framework should be pretty hard to link into, because if it's not, that means your opponent kind of can do whatever in the framework level, and as long as they win the contention level, they're like chilling. That's not like a good thing you want to have, because you want your opponent to debate framework and you want to make the debate harder on them. So having an easy link is definitely a trade-off. Do you have any additional deont trade-offs you want to mention before we go to China?
No.
Word.
Yes.
Oh wait, did you say that you were going to mention a deont framework that you ran?
Oh, are you doing that this lecture?
Just as an example.
Do you want to hear that?
Yes.
Okay. If you want to pull it up, I can log into my Dropbox.
Can you put it in the drive on that?
That actually makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we have a 2-minute break where you can sit there, and we're calling it a break.
Anyone want a Mamba? Oh, you found? Is that your? Okay, good. Yeah.
Okay, I uploaded it.
And what I'm really learned
What drive?
Wait. Some of the tags. Wait, I need to fix this.
Wait, why?
There are just a bunch of question marks.
Grass on the side of the sidewalk. I thought that was a good idea.
Oh, no, it doesn't.
Hey, chilling.
It's
Alright, where is it?
Yeah, it's Butler.
Yep.
Where is it?
It's LG. It's an LG.
Okay, break over.
Guys, this is a case I ran. Did anyone debate this topic? Sam, Pursoon, Jagger, Jack. That makes a lot of sense because I know that all of these people were debating that. Okay. Wait, can I control the computer? You should zoom in. I'm just gonna sit here and talk about it. Oh. Okay. Hi everyone. This is how Catherine made a deontological framework. The thing that Pursoon was talking about earlier, where sometimes you can just say like, this is bad because we have to look at consequences without actually justifying it, doesn't work as well if your framework is justified. So, okay, this topic was about lethal autonomous weapons. You did that one? Okay. Does anyone know what a lethal autonomous weapon is? I mean, I guess if you debated it, you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. They are very dangerous. They're weapons that are lethal and autonomous. Okay.
It's basically lethal weapons that are run by a robot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it would be like, imagine a drone,
Yeah.
but no one's controlling it. They just kill on command. So they would just like, Yeah.
Not even like remote control. Just like the
Just
program.
straight up.
It was pretty awesome.
you would
It was really fun.
you would like detect like a face or something and just like shoot them. Like that was what they did. So this was one of my asks on this topic.
One.
I had 2. I ran this one, and then when I thought a judge couldn't understand it, I didn't run it. So, okay. So the case was states ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons. So maybe we should not have killer robots. Okay. So observation, this was the setup, which is that these don't exist. So we don't know how effective they're going to be. They're probably susceptible to a lot of problems. Maybe they won't be. We don't know. So this is the idea that consequences, that you're shutting out consequences because we literally do not have the ability to evaluate them. This was also strategic because no one responded to it. And I would just be like, okay, this is like I don't care if your case tells me something is going to happen if there's literally no evidence of anything happening yet because they don't exist. Anyways. Yeah, I valued life. And then I said, to be clear, this is not bare life. So the idea was that, okay, let me explain this. Okay, the idea that, okay, I read this, I did not read this book. I skimmed this book. I skimmed 3 pages of this book and then made a framework off of it. The precariousness of life is the idea that your life could be lost at any moment. And that explains why we have obligations to each other to respect each other in the before someone dies, if that makes sense. So that's point A. Point B, oh God, what does it say? Okay, so the idea that other frameworks that try to explain how obligations work are all dependent on explaining how we have relationships with others in order to facilitate those obligations in the first place. So until we recognize someone as human, which means recognizing their life as something that is valuable rather than a number, and these are 2 different things. So recognizing someone's life is different from recognizing that someone is like a living being. Only then can we create obligations towards one another. Does that kind of make sense?
Can you elaborate on that?
Okay, wait.
Life versus like
So like something can be living but not be recognized as something that is like worthy of respect. And that's the difference. Something that is worthy of respect is like what I called recognizing life, if that makes sense. So like something that is like, I don't know, like a cow, it would be like something that's living but is not like, I'm not like I respect, like I really respect and would grieve the life of a cow if it died. Like the idea is that we would grieve each other if we died, and that is what makes us human, and that is what allows us to recognize our relationships with one another.
This is also a good example of like mixing and matching like your own analysis plus like target literature.
Oh yeah, I just made this up.
Yeah.
To be clear, I just came up with this. Okay. Yeah. So the criterion is recognizing grievability. Yeah. That is a fun word. Yes.
People just, I'm assuming they just responded, you can grieve animals too.
They actually did not respond that.
What? Really?
What did they respond on this? What did you respond on this when you lost?
What would you say?
Sorry.
What would you say if
I
people
s-
said that you can like grieve animals too?
I honestly,
Yeah.
what did I say?
Okay. What? Like.
I definitely was like.
Oh, sorry. Let me answer that really quick.
Okay.
Okay. I think that's usually contradictory to most frameworks that people ran anyways. Like, there's no debate that anyone has ever had that's like, I really care about animals and put them on the same like no one's impact is about wait. Okay, there are debates where this can happen, but like like on topics that are not like literally about animal rights or veganism, like most people are not going for animal impacts, like they're going for human impacts, right?
I was gonna say keep an eye out for the Nats topic.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
No.
So like given that we have this bias towards humans anyways, like you're probably just saying that because I'm running this framework. Like I don't like yeah. So it's usually like contradictory to their position. That was my response. That would be my response. Otherwise I would be like humans are different from animals anyways, and I'd give reasons why that's true.
What did I say to it?
Yeah.
Good question. I think I just talked about how laws don't violate breathability somehow. I don't remember what I just talked about.
Real. Okay. Grievability, I say right here, is the ability for a living being to be mourned after death. So when someone dies, do I care? And this is not contingent on them actually dying. It's like, if this person were to die, would I care? If I would care, then I respect them a lot more in life, right? So that's what this is. Point A. This is what I just talked about, where it's like the state of living and life are different things. Like you can be alive but not be recognized as a human. This is what justifies a lot of rights violations. You're like, these people are literally like subhuman or whatever, or you categorize a group of people as not deserving of the same rights as other humans ought to have, and so you treat them as almost like a different species. Point B. Grievability explains what oppression is and how it occurs in wartime. Why is this true? I have no idea. I have to read the card. Okay. Do you know what this means? In this case. Okay, wait. Why do we feel moral repulsion in the face of suicide bombing in war?
Violence, that's when we like can actually.
Okay, it's this idea of like, so state-sponsored violence and like violence that is not state-sponsored, we treat differently. So like, if someone like bombs the United States, and we are like American citizens, we feel, but when I say we, I mean like the American public. So like you individually may or may not feel this way, but we would feel a lot more like indignation towards it versus if we were bombing people abroad, right? So the idea is that we do not grieve those who we are causing harm to. It's only those in proximity to us that we grieve, which is bad. Okay. Point C. Grieving has political potential by creating public outrage. So this is a consequential justification for a deontological framework. So even if it didn't actually create public outrage, like it would still be good because it has the ability to do so. Does that make sense? So the idea is that if we are able to grieve people, then that means we feel mad when they die. If we feel mad when they die, we can challenge structures of power that allow them to die. So if we care about people getting bombed abroad, then we actually can accumulate like the political capital we need in order to challenge like the military structures that allow that to happen. If we don't care about them getting bombed abroad because we don't feel remorse for them because of like proximity, because we don't grieve them, then that is really bad because now that violence continues endlessly. Point D. This is also something I made up. Yeah, this is what I just said. So you can pursue endless wars if you don't grieve people, if you don't respect them while they're living, if you wouldn't feel sad if they died. This framework took me 4 minutes to read. Like, this was 4 minutes of my AF. You have 6 minutes to read an AF. So like, if you're running a deontological framework, it should definitely take like a significant portion of time, like 1.5 to 3 minutes, like at least probably, but you need like a lot of justification in order to explain a deontological framework. The case was one contention, which was misrecognition. 3 points. Okay, point A is that lethal autonomous weapons don't recognize people, or they misrecognize people because they do things based on algorithms. So the idea that you are not actually recognizing people for who they are, it automatically violates grievability because you aren't recognizing another human being. Second thing is like the proximity argument, which is like when you deploy killer robots instead of your own soldiers, there are no, like, for example, if the US goes to war with another country and there are no American soldiers returning home dead, then we care a lot less about the war that's going on because we aren't losing any of our own people. So the idea is that when only people abroad are dying, then you just like don't care about what's happening anymore. So you don't grieve them either. Third thing is, oh, this was also like an end quote thing that we talked about is an example of one. Like, I don't know, Vietnam War, we cared a lot about American casualties. It developed a lot of like public sympathy. Okay, point C. Definitionally, the lethal autonomous weapon cannot grieve lives because it is a robot. It is literally built to kill people. It has no other purpose. A lethal autonomous weapon cannot have empathy for another human being. It automatically violates this principle that I've set up, just like based on the definition of what a lethal autonomous weapon is. The reason why this was strategic is because A, nobody understood it. It's like very difficult to respond to this. Do you guys see why? Yeah. Yes.
What were like the neg arguments for this, like out of curiosity?
Bad.
The main one.
For like in favor of lethal autonomous weapons?
For
wait,
this
like,
topic?
Yeah.
Topic?
Oh.
There-
What did you guys?
I ran imperialism on the negative, which is yeah, I prepped it just for Pursuit.
I ran like a security framework actually.
I think I ran something like less wars or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I said that like
Efficiency.
I said that like one, this isn't going to be effective because like terrorists and rogue states like North Korea are gonna like pursue them anyways. And then I also said that like some types of weapons are getting so fast and high speed, like supersonic missiles, that the only way to reasonably like defend against them and prevent like and ensure that like deterrence and mutually assured destruction still stays like a thing is with lethal autonomous weapons.
Yeah.
Like think of like hypersonic missiles. So the concept of like mutually assured destruction is the idea like if we fire like nukes at you, you're gonna be able to like fire back at us. What happens if what happens if one country believes their missiles are fast enough where they're not gonna be able to like be detected to like be shot down, and you can like target the other like the missile infrastructure or electric infrastructure of that country so they can't fire back. The mutually assured destruction just like isn't a thing anymore because they won't be able to fire back. So lethal autonomous weapons are the only way to like ensure that this still stays a thing and war doesn't break out.
Real.
One like specific to Butler maybe is like if war is like becoming less like manpower and more detached from that and like airstrikes, missiles, planes, whatever. Like this would be a good way to avoid like any casualties in war. Is having lethal autonomous weapons fight wars instead of humans.
Yeah, that'd be a good response. That like if we just have like robot war instead, then like we wouldn't even have to worry about grieving people because there are no people. The response to that is just like the countries that are making killer robots are not the countries that are having war waged on them. Like if you're like it's probably like I don't know, there are like 6 countries who have this in development. I don't know, it was a whole topic. But yeah, like
I also think a response could be made that like, okay, you like say specifically in your framework that's not just like an ends thing.
Yeah.
And so like even the capacity to be grieved. So like let's say hypothetically there are robot wars, casualties could still occur due to like collateral.
Yeah.
And like so like there's still the whole idea that if someone were to die in that war zone, we wouldn't care.
Yes.
What would you say is the best way to attack these types of frameworks?
If it's like a good framework, okay, wait, let me think. I actually haven't thought about how you beat my framework. Guys, maybe this is a good exercise.
As good as like yours, you can just be in general.
Yeah.
So, at the core of your framework is like valuable because you like willingly inflict harms on the women soldiers and people to understand the value of war. Isn't that like bad? I don't know.
Yeah, so that would be a. Or wait. Is the idea that there's like a deontological argument that's like you are intending harm on your own soldiers?
Well, like, what I'm understanding from your statement is that the reason people counts by like breathability is because they remove the perpetrators from the violence of their actions.
Yeah.
So if you intentionally require people to voluntarily fight themselves in order to understand the consequences of their actions, then that would insinuate A, that this action is already inherently bad for everyone involved, so we should recognize the morality of that in itself. But then B, you ask people to hurt themselves in order to value the lives of others, which is probably a bad perspective to have. I don't know.
Would you just like reject war though?
Yeah, that would be a really good response. My response though would be like, I would rather like this the way that this framework would optimally work is that war just doesn't happen. So if in the process we have to like make people realize how bad it is by inflicting wounds on like our own soldiers just so it can finally end, then that is still something that's good because that's the only way we achieve grievability.
We'll also address this on like framework presentation after lunch. But when there's ideas of like deontological ideas about like using someone to prove a point or like to achieve an end goal, that can be unjustified, but it can also be justified in certain scenarios. Like it depends. Like
Oh, like protest.
yeah. Or there's a moral difference between like forced conscription into the military compared to like running off of like a volunteer like military.
Yeah.
Okay, we should move on.
Oh yeah. Wait, I feel like Kira had a question and I just asked Heidi's question without coming back to Kira's question.
Oh, I was just asking like in general how to like attack them. Well, like not specifically yours. just
Like strategies to attack the frameworks.
Okay, so all of the generic responses we had, you can lay onto any deontological framework, like regardless of what it is. Specificity-wise, you probably just have to listen to their arguments closely and come up with things that are just like wrong with it. We'll also talk about argument generation tomorrow, I think, for things that you do not have blocks for. I think Heidi came up with a really good response, which is that like you're using people,
Yeah.
which is like maybe bad.
Does uniqueness matter to the frameworks, would you say?
Uniqueness
Like,
isn't.
is that something you can point out as an opposition that like grievability is like
Oh yeah.
lacking within normal war as well? Something like that.
Uniqueness is something that is less applicable to Deont because even if this is not the only thing or even the biggest thing that contributes to a problem, for example, maybe there are other reasons why war happens other than grievability, then a Deont person would just be like, okay, well, those are also immoral. Like, why does that mean that this is not immoral? So that's a little bit difficult. That being said, you can make uniqueness arguments on like these framework justifications. I don't know if this is confusing, but where is it? The one about endless war. Okay. If you were like, we can do this without recognizing grievability, that would be a response to this framework. So if there are ways in which we can not grieve people and wars wouldn't happen that you could come up with, then that would be a response. You would just have to listen to the specific tags and arguments that they read, ask questions about it, etc. Oh, also ask a lot of questions about deontological frameworks. If you don't understand anything, chances are the judge probably also doesn't. Chances are the debater also probably doesn't. So you can usually get them to like say confusing things. Yes. And then also once you hear it once, you will be able to like read it. Like if you ask for their evidence, they will probably give it to you. And then you can read it and like probably look up the theory as well and read about it because no one is making a new deontological case every tournament. So those are some strategies. Yes.
All right.
Real.
Any last questions on that? Cool. All right, we should get back to the actual topic. All right, where were we? Okay, so let's apply these two schools of thought to. Can you,
No.
please? To the China resolution. All right, so I think these are, yeah. So these are just like some of the examples or arguments that we came up with yesterday. So can we like think of consequential like weighing to each of these? So let's start with poverty. Does anyone have like a consequential reason why poverty is bad?
Well, in terms of scope, it could affect like a large amount of people considering that China has like some of the most people in the world, but also in terms of magnitude, we could talk about how severe the impacts of poverty are, whether it's like not being able to afford housing, inflation, food, etc.
Yeah. Yep.
We talked about this from yesterday. Poverty. Many people, China.
Yes.
In China. Really bad. And we talked about all of those things that you can afford yesterday.
Right. Inequality.
Inequality? Wait. No. No.
So, okay, never mind.
Inequality is more down.
Yeah, climate change. Well, if it was, never mind. Okay, yeah.
Severe magnitude and scope as it affects the entire Earth, and on magnitude too. So.
Can you elaborate on magnitude?
So like, it can raise sea levels. It can cause more disastrous weather events such as droughts, floods, and other things that can also. It can lead to more people having to leave their homes and become refugees, stuff like that.
Sure.
I would say you could also use time frame considering that there's like a lot of studies that say that like you need like a decade for these many countries to reduce their carbon consumption, otherwise we'll have irreversible damage or like
Yeah.
It'll raise by like 1 Celsius.
Yes. So like, this is an example of where you can use like evidence within the metrics, because there are studies that depict time frame for climate change. There are studies that depict like, we didn't talk about reversibility, but that is one metric. Like the reversibility of climate change is also something that is documented and studied. So, all right. Any other ideas on climate change? All right, innovation.
I would say it has a lot of long-term impacts, like in terms of how it could affect society and how they'll use it.
Yeah.
Can you be more specific?
Like they could use carbon capture technology that we talked about that they could use for a long time to reduce carbon emissions.
Also, maybe on this topic, there's not just innovations that you think can steal ground about like carbon capture, but also innovation in terms of things that are just good for people. So like healthcare innovation would be really good in like prolonging people's lives, making it more accessible, etc.
Yeah. Like infrastructure in general is like innovation. Yeah. Okay. Life expectancy. This one kind of ties into the other ones, but.
I think this is like an impact that draws on.
Yeah.
Like all of these lead in. Like this is an impact to another impact. Yeah.
All right. International implications. So like think of like the global sphere. What happens when China?
Or like why do international impacts matter?
Yeah. In terms of the metrics. Yeah.
It could help like the least advantaged in countries that are like more affected by climate change due to like geographical location.
Yeah. We also talked about like supply chains and how like a lot of the countries that China trades with aren't necessarily like the most developed countries. So.
Question about this thing where we talk about a certain population we help. Why is it more important that we help the least well off?
Because they may not have the materials or the access to do so themselves.
Yes. Anyone else have ideas? It's also probably like the most severe. Because if you don't have the resources, or like those who are least well off generally have the most severe kind of suffering. So the magnitude is much worse for them. Even if you would like on scope help more people who are not the least well off, the marginal benefit they get is maybe not as important as the magnitude or the severity of the problems that you would fix by helping the least well off. Also scope, because they're international impacts. Yes.
But that was something they were supposed to answer.
Oh, I forgot. well, I hope
All
we
right.
figured that out. That the world is bigger than
China.
a couple people. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. deontological applications on China. Some app frameworks you could think about. Also, this is obviously not comprehensive, as was our topic analysis yesterday. Like to do grievability, I just like did a lot of like rabbit hole Google searching. So there are definitely things that you could run outside of this probably. Some I thought of are like things about justice or fairness. The idea that if China is contributing to global emissions, then they have an obligation or responsibility to try to reverse the damage they've done. And maybe there's some way you could justify that, even if it would cause people a lot of harm, even if it would like plunge people into poverty, etc. Environmental rights is another thing. Like people, you can justify a right to a sustainable environment. So anything in pursuit of that goal would be moral, even if it would cause some other bad things to happen. Okay, let's justify this. Why do people have a right to a sustainable environment? Right to a sustainable environment. Yes.
I guess you could argue maybe it's a lot of other rights and basic necessities. So you could argue right to like human dignity in general if they have a
Yep. Yeah, so if it's true that the environment needs to be good, or we need to have resources to have like houses or clean water or food, those are other rights that all stem from this right. So maybe this is like the mega right that we should always make sure we're protecting. Yeah, I think that's actually the main thing. I don't know, I didn't think of anything else. Does anyone else have other ideas that I did not think of? Animals? Oh, yeah, you could talk about animals. If you wanted to go like non-anthropocentric, you could be like, animals matter too. And they have rights to our environment. They aren't doing anything wrong. They don't want us to kill the environment. You could also talk about like certain groups of people as well, who you were like actively disrespecting because they don't contribute anything to climate change, but you do. Yep. Yeah. It's the only one we've got. Only one. Guys, we can't live anywhere else as of right now. Maybe we will in the future. But like we live on one Earth. So maybe we have a right to a sustainable environment because you can't move somewhere else that's better. Okay, yeah, those are all good justifications. Some neg frameworks. I'll start with the second subpoint, which is that neg, because you're defending the economy, is probably less deontology friendly than the AF. I don't know, that's just my personal opinion. Maybe you can come up with something though. If you want to run state obligations, which Sam will also talk about later, you can run things about security or like ensuring quality of life. Wait a minute, that sounds really consequential. The idea is that economic growth is like a necessary condition for quality of life to happen. So like, even if it does not produce quality of life, if we got rid of it, then it would be much easier to like violate security, violate your quality of life. So that is the way you run that deontologically, where you're like, even if this doesn't happen, it is necessary that economic growth exists or the economy is stable in order for these things to be protected in the future. This is like the key distinction that we should think of when we think of deontology, which is that the difference is that one thing is like necessary for something to happen, one thing is like debating about whether the thing actually does happen. Yes. Okay. That is our presentation. Does anyone have questions? Yeah, Jagger?
So why do you run like a
Deontological?
yeah, whatever.
Big
versus
word.
a consequentialist framework? Why is that one better? Why? Like, is there?
Well, it depends on like the type
Yeah.
of like debate you're most comfortable with. So like, would you say you're more like do you like it like impact weighing in the contention level, or do you like debating framework?
I guess I like impact weighing more.
Then
You would probably prefer like there's no like real like
Yeah, there's,
rule
like,
to use
yeah.
one or the other. Just whichever one you feel like you're a better debater with.
It also like really depends on the ground the like resolution gives you.
yeah,
Yeah.
like on neg, like your negative ground for consequentialism is just wider than it is for deontology, so maybe that makes you want to run consequentialism. Also, like even if you are uncomfortable defending framework, like if it is something that you want to try doing and testing it, you should like maybe do it. I had another thought, then I forgot it. Okay, Kira.
This is unrelated to what we're seeing right now, but what does purple mean? Why does it say Ukraine/Queer?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So, do you want to explain this?
Okay, so there's a few of those. Basically, what's going on is we're having like.
Oh, that thing.
Okay, so we're having like affinity groups, and so basically, what an affinity group is, it's like a group that's like shares a common identity to talk about certain issues or just talk about their experiences. And so what's going to go on is the first one is going to tell you like if you're not part of that group. So in that case, if you're not queer, then like you'll go to a separate presentation that's talking about the Russia-Ukraine crisis, or like the war now, it is. And however, if you're rolling with LGBT, you get to like we're gonna go to like another room. We're gonna talk about like what's going on in South Dakota debate, particularly, or just the debate community in general. What like experiences we've had in debate rounds and at the tournaments, and what we think South Dakota and debate circuit in general could do to improve. So that's the general idea for it. And it's only like 30 minutes long, but we think it's something that'd be beneficial because here you get to like build up on ideas about topic literature or things going on in the world that are applicable to future resolutions, or you get to actually like discuss ways we can make life better for people participating in this activity.
Also,
Are we gonna be doing multiple of these? Like,
Yeah.
Okay.
So the one that Kira just asked about, that's for the queer community. Afterwards, there's also gonna be one later in the day. Is it still going on?
It says global power and balance after something.
Yeah, that one is.
wait on making announcements about that one.
Okay. Well, for sure, there will be a presentation about global power imbalances. That's basically talking about like the difference between the. Once it starts up.
Can you do stand-up comedy while we wait?
No, I'm really bad at it actually.
So I think that's the perfect reason that you need to try it.
Oh no.
We're trying to
You
get
don't
over
have
the
any thoughts on airline food?
On what?
Airline food?
Okay, there you go. It's great. Okay, got out of it. Okay. I actually do. Okay. I'm gonna stand over here for the time being until Prasoon gets back.
Wait, what can I press it?
Oh, yeah, you can.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Get the big chair.
Yeah.
Wait, are we recording right now?
Prasoon said we were.
I don't trust him.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so, for the next like half an hour, we're gonna talk about observations, what they are, how to use them effectively, and we're gonna look at some examples. Okay, so what is an observation? So basically, it's an analytic in the framework. It comes before your valuing criterion. But it basically tells the judge how they should view the resolution, and it defines the like parameters of the debate round. So yeah, it's going to, you can use the resolution to explain to the judge why some arguments shouldn't be applicable, or why there's like a specific area you should focus on, or it sets certain burdens for both debaters on what they need to prove their side of the resolution true. And normally this is included before the valuing criterion. So you'd say like, I affirm the resolution resolved, here are some definitions, observation, blah, 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 value criterion. Okay, so why would you want to have an observation? So first of all, good observations can preempt arguments that the other side might run. For example, think of Catherine's case with the butler. That was essentially preempting negative, talking about consequentialist arguments. And so basically, with that, the next point is that it can save time in your 1AR. Instead of having to give... So it saves time in the 1AR. So instead of having to fully address negative case arguments, like you still should, but tomorrow we're going to be talking about the 1AR, and it's a really hard speech because you have 4 minutes to respond to 7 minutes of arguments. So you want to try and minimize the amount of time as possible. And one way to do that is with observations. You can like get up there and just make an argument against their thing, saying that like this doesn't fit into the observation or what the parameters of this debate round is, so don't weigh this argument or don't buy it. It's basically just telling the judge, like, even if this is true or what they say is true, it still isn't a reason to vote for them because it's not what we're debating about. There are other reasons that you might want to run observations. For instance, you can use observations to be a time suck. Once again, the 1AR is a really hard speech, so the negative case might want to include an observation above their framework and make it so that the 1AR has to address it, or else like they might run into trouble. Because a lot of times if you drop observations or don't address them well enough, it puts the side that was running the observation way ahead in the round. And so this forces the 1AR to cover the observation, and if they're not well versed in like what it is or they don't fully understand what the observation is saying, they can use up a lot of time trying to address it. And that means not only will they spend so much time addressing that they undercover the rest of the negative case. So they're forced to choose between like addressing this observation, and they might or might not like lose the round if they don't. And even if like they disprove the observation, they could still lose on the contention level because they undercovered it. So yeah, if you make and another thing is like if you make an observation they can't leak into, it basically wins you the round if they don't respond, because they'd have to in order to like have some type of ground in it. And so another thing that you can do with this is you can run an observation purely as a time suck and then have zero intention of like extending it or warranting it out in future rebuttals. Just say, okay, I kick my observation. And this is really abusive. I wouldn't encourage you to do this, but it's strategies people do, and you should be prepared for it in rounds, just because it happens. People will run observations just so you waste time. So be prepared to understand what the observation is saying. And in cross-examination, if you don't know what it's saying, because sometimes they word it really bad or it's really vague, it's a good use of cross-ex time to ask them specific questions. Like, what does this mean? What burdens does it set for us? What do I need to show to like follow with the observation? Okay. And another reason people might run some observations is to be abusive and unfair. Last year at DDI, we joked that observations were the Haber special because there was a debater who liked to run them and were fairly abusive with it. Again, like you can like make an argument that is like super abusive and just saying like, if I prove this one thing, then I win. And it's like a truism almost. And if you don't respond to it and they prove this like one thing true, they like win the rounding if you're like winning on substance.
What do you think is like, I guess, the most eloquent way to word it? Because sometimes I've just straight up said like, this is abusive, and judges don't like that. So
Yeah. Some, you can.
Like, what's an example of one that's like abusive?
Okay. This will come. Yeah. There was one example that I ran into at Nats, and literally what it was saying is, okay, so the Nationals resolution this year was, if radicalism is preferable to incrementalism to achieve social justice, and my opponent on the affirmative advocating for radicalism said that all the affirmative needs to prove is to show one avenue of like change that radicalism can access, then incrementalism can't. Like if radicalism creates one different avenue for people to make change, then you vote AF. And yeah, and so there's a couple ways you can address them. It kind of depends on each observation, and we'll get into this with like addressing observations. But one, you can call it abusive, but you need to warrant out why it's abusive. For instance, one really fun way to do it that makes you seem like you're like the ethical one is saying like on the ballots and the NSA rules, it tells you to prove the resolution true as a general principle. And so just because they're showing one instance where radicalism works, that's not proving the resolution true as a general principle. Like it's hyper-specific. Another way you can address observations is you can ask them why this is only true for the affirmative. So this is so the first argument about like NSDA rules is what I ran, like general principle. The second argument I ran was that it's abusive to say that only if the affirmative shows one avenue that radicalism can achieve change, that incrementalism can't they win, and not apply that to the negative side. So for example, if the negative can prove that incrementalism accesses a way to make change that radicalism can't, then that would mean they win too. Insofar as like, and then you can like show that this observation is ridiculous because there are different avenues that both can access, and it just makes it a wash.
Another thing you can say is like, this allows you to make non-arguments, which is why it's abusive.
Yeah.
Like you can just be like, here's a hypothetical scenario that I just made up in my mind where radicalism would work and incrementalism wouldn't. Obviously that's super uncomparative. That's like not the point of what debate is supposed to be. And you have infinite ways to come up with hypothetical scenarios, whereas the negative has has to like beat all like infinite possibilities. So
Yeah.
you have literally no ground in the debate. So it's unwinnable.
Yeah, another good way you can respond to observations is, okay, so because an observation is like telling you how to view the resolution in terms of like the debate round, you should look at what the resolution is saying. So another argument that someone ran, or like an observation that they ran, was on the negative side advocating for incrementalism, and their observation was that radicalism is both in like right-wing and left-wing circles, so the affirmative needs to defend the impacts of like right-wing radical movements. That seems reasonable until you look at the resolution and it specifically says preferable to achieve social justice. And insofar as like a lot more like left-wing movements arguably are trying to advance social justice, and you can show examples of that, it's not enough to say that like right-wing radicals are bad because they make up the minority of like radical movements trying to achieve social justice. So it's not proving the resolution true as a general principle. And secondly, once again, it's like a double standard that this observation doesn't address that incremental movements can also be leveraged by the opposition party to harm social justice as well.
It might be like kind of confusing, like if you are switching,
Yeah.
like events, but like when you're trying to find, or like when you're debating against an observation and you're trying to decide, or like if it's an abusive one, just think about like how much ground you get versus how much ground the opponent gets.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also like ask them this in cross-examination. It's like, just ask them, what do I need to do to like fulfill the observation or whatever, and then ask them, what do you need to do to fulfill the observation. And if there's like an unequal like burden within those questions, then you know it's an abusive observation.
What do we do if you ask like what would I do and then they say that's not my burden, because that's what I've heard every single
Yeah.
time. When it's your burden to prove.
Wait, it's your burden to prove what your
how
burden
you fit
is.
into their observation.
Well, if you're asking about their observation, they have to like clarify.
Yeah.
The
Like,
observation is burden setting.
yeah, like you just like maybe like don't worry as like what do I need to prove to fit within the burden? Like ask them what the burden is. And then once they like tell you what the burden is, you can like get up in rebuttal and say like I prove it.
Like, what do I need to do to win?
Yeah.
Ask specifically about the observation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are the good ways to go about it. And that's another thing with observations, because observations are a lot of the time super analytical because they're specifically interpreting the resolution. It's going to be like students writing up their own observations and what they think are going to win them the rounds. And a lot of times it's going to be like really vague, worded in really odd ways if they're not intentional with it. And you can, one, maybe catch them on something, on how they word it, or you can, like, you should use time in cross-examination if it's unclear to figure out what the observation is saying. Because if you try and rebut the observation without knowing what it's saying, you might not address its like warrants or what it's trying to say, so they can just extend it. And if you like spend time in cross-examination trying to figure that out, it can like save you the round. Dwyer, you had a question?
Can you use like? Actually, never mind. Should you use like evidence or like a card maybe in a resolutional
Yeah,
Depends.
you can. Like, yeah.
Okay, if you're like, this is the definition of something in the resolution, and that implies this, therefore this is my observation, then you read a card. If you're just like, it's like the same thing that you would do with any other argument. Like, if you need evidence to make the argument, then you use evidence. If you don't need evidence to make the argument, then you don't. And if you can make do like logically.
Yeah. A really good like standard to know if you should have a card for something or not is if you're like citing an empiric. Like if you're just like making like a general like interpretation about the resolution, there's no empirics there or statements of facts that you would need to back up with a source. But if you're on the lethal autonomous weapons topic and your observation is that lethal autonomous weapons don't exist yet, so don't weigh consequentialist arguments, then you need a card for that, which is exactly what Catherine included in her grievability aff. So it just depends on what you're trying to say with it. Okay. All right, so...
Also, quick sidetrack. Observations are also called resolutional analysis.
Yeah.
Sometimes RAs, but they're one of those.
Yeah. So next up is what makes a good observation. A good observation is normally active. And what do I mean by this? So basically, when you're writing it, it should more often than not be effective for you or be able to be leveraged in the round. So basically what I mean by that is don't write it, and like if you're on affirmative, don't write it and then like just in case the negative talks about this one obscure thing and then you can kick it. Normally, it's good for observations to act as offense for you or to like drastically frame how the round works. Like, for example, Catherine's was really good because it wasn't preempting some like really obscure argument that someone might run. It was like preempting the majority of arguments that are going to be made on the negative side of that topic. It was saying don't buy consequential arguments, and that did two things. That one was able to like set up arguments to like kick the entire negative case, and then also it set up her own case as deontological. So that's what a good observation does. It's active, it preempts common arguments you're going to expect, and it can shape what you're going to talk about in your case.
Plus, an observation like the one Catherine had is like fairly defensive, but like Sam said, because it's like taking out such a majority, like it's taking out like deont versus consequentialism, it's taking out the other half. It's definitely like offense that you can win on, which is a good type of defense that you want to have.
Yeah.
Is everyone familiar with what kicking means?
Okay, so just to make it clear, I'm using kicking kind of wrong just now. So like there's like I kind of am like
I mean, kicking is like your own argument.
Yeah.
Kicking is like the opposite. Okay, kicking is like you run an argument and by the end of the round you're no longer defending it. So this is like you run a contention and I'm asked. I say what am I saying? Okay, no, I'm neg. I'm like climate change doesn't matter, and app is like absolutely blasts me by the end of the round. I'm just like, okay, like
Yeah.
take this first contention, I'm not defending it anymore, and then I win off of my other offense. So, yeah, I forgot what you were talking about, so I don't remember.
like what kicking is.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, kicking is a term you use for your own cases, and essentially what it means is that like you kick it, so you just like drop it off the flow, and so you like will transfer over to like an argument your opponent made, or you just don't address it and it's not a voter for you anymore. So there are two things you can normally kick. It's one, your framework. So let's say you have a framework and your opponent has another framework and you think you're losing on it or don't have the time to address why your framework should win. If you look at what their framework is and it's either really similar to yours or for whatever reason your contentions also will happen to fit under their framework, like you could win on their own framework, you can just kick your own framework and say, we're going to be looking at this round through the negatives framework. I concede to it, but I'm going to show you why under their own framework I still win.
So this is like what it would look like if you're flowing it. And this is a situation where me as black, Catherine as green, I would want to kick contention one. Well, if I had the intention of kicking it. So like, if I have a contention like this that I know is not going to be something I want to defend, and that I'm expecting it to be heavily blocked out, then I can confidently just like get rid of it in my later speeches and just extend contention two. So I would be like, just like some stupid response, and then I would focus on these two. Eco-terrorist.
Also,
That was literally what happened to me at nationals. Actually, I got.
You can do a stupid response. You can also literally say, "I'm kicking this
Yeah.
argument."
Yeah.
It depends on the judge though, because some judges do not like dropping arguments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was literally a case I had to debate against at nationals, except it was Sam equals eco-terrorist. It was,
In the tag,
yeah,
like, my opponent
is an eco-terrorist. So that was the whole thing about like defend both good and bad types of radicalism.
For those who may not know, could you elaborate on what you mean when you say concede?
Yeah. So,
I agree to my opponent's framework.
yeah.
Yeah, so like, you're running, okay, so AF has framework, neg has framework. You guys constructed your framework, like, in conjunction with your contentions, so obviously, like, your contentions are probably more relevant to your own framework, but oftentimes the things are consequential. So if someone's running, like, generic consequentialism and someone's running, like, minimizing oppression, for example, or minimizing structural violence, and my generic arguments are about like climate change, and they're like totally winning framework. They're like generic consequentialism is really, really bad. And I can be like, okay, I concede the framework, and then I'm going to impact out climate change in terms of minimizing oppression. So I'm going to be like, this hurts people, or this hurts minorities who are in urban centers. This hurts the least well-off who like lose their homes and can't like afford like the high luxury homes that are going to be available now. This hurts people who like can't afford food anymore, etc. And so I link back into their framework, even if this is not what I intended in the first place, by impacting out my arguments and explaining them in a way such that it relates to what my opponent's framework is.
And there's going to be an entire presentation on like the 1AR where normally kicking occurs. And so we'll be going over kicking and like when it can be effective for you and when you shouldn't do it. Because there are specific arguments that the negative can make on your contentions where you can't just kick it because they've been able to turn it into offense for themselves. So, yeah. We'll go on back to observations for the meantime, but we'll be addressing kicking and all of that later on tomorrow. So, yeah, so one thing, so like it should be effective for you and you should be able to leverage it in the round. And as negative, you can basically always ensure this. So let's say you have an observation saying that the affirmative can't run a specific type of argument. As negative, you will always hear what the affirmative says before you go up and give your case. So if you have your observation that says the affirmative shouldn't run this argument, and then in their case, they just don't run the argument, why would you read the observation? So like when you're reading your case, you can just like skip over it and just go straight to value. And that's really good because one, it saves you time so you can use it to actually rebut their case more. And secondly, it allows you like more time in cross-ex to like not get muddled up in the weeds of an argument that just doesn't matter. So yeah, good observations, like we said before, they reframe the debate in a severe way. It forces the other side to debate on your terms. So now suddenly the negative or the affirmative have to explain why this observation isn't true and why you should still buy my arguments and this isn't how we should view the resolution or how they fit within the observation and their arguments can still be weighed. It like really puts them on the back pedal trying to like justify their case within terms of the observation.
Observations at their core are just burden setting for the round. So what does AF have to do to win? What does neg have to do to win? Due to some like interpretation of how the resolution is written. Good observations typically don't set different burdens for each side because then that's really suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
Usually you want a burden that sets the same burden for you and your opponent, but it's easier for you to meet the burden. But it sounds much less abusive if you're like, we both have to do this and like not explain why it's easier for you to do that versus saying, I only have to prove one example of this being true, because that sounds like they're like incredibly different burdens to win the round.
Yeah. Okay, so how should you respond to observations? We went over this a bit during questions, but we can still go over it for the sake of just hammering it in, or if there's something we skipped over. So things to look for when you hear an observation. So first of all, the first thing you should ask yourself when they go up and read an observation about what you need to prove is, do you violate the observation? So basically, let's say the affirmative gets up there and reads like an anti-consequentialist observation, saying like, don't weigh consequentialist arguments in this round, only look at deontological arguments. If your negative case is deontological and it doesn't use consequentialism, then you don't need to refute the observation. You can just say, I agree with the observation, but look at my case, I fit within it, it's deontological. Another thing you can look for is, do they violate their own observation? A lot of times it happens, and it's kind of the same with framework. Like, sometimes debaters will like write an observation thinking it's really good, and then they'll like accidentally contradict themselves when they're talking in case. And so if you find a contradiction like that, where it's like, don't weigh this type of impact, and then they talk about that own impact in their case, you can bring that up and say they contradict themselves, so don't weigh this argument that they themselves read. And that sets you up to like make a really easy response to ignore a lot of their case.
Happened in LD finals last year at nurse camp. That was such
Yeah.
a fun round.
Actually?
Yeah.
No, the observation contradicted one of the contentions, but then, who won? Was it?
It was Max Lightfield.
Max Lightfield. He kicked both the observation and the contention that violated it.
Yeah.
This one for the other one.
Yeah, so what happened was the negative read an observation, like, don't weigh consequences. Then their first contention was entirely about the consequences, and their second contention was deontological, and all the affirmative case was consequential. And so the affirmative got up there, said they contradict themselves, don't buy contention 1, but then they didn't, they undercovered contention 2 a lot and didn't address like deontological arguments for it. So then the negative got up there in the next speech and said, my opponent never refuted the observation. They just say one of my contentions violated also. Okay, don't buy my first contention, but also don't buy any of their case, which means the only thing you have to vote on within the parameters of the debate is my contention 2. So that's basically what happens. So that's an important thing to know. Like, just because one part of their case might end up contradicting it, that doesn't mean the entire case gets thrown out the window, only the parts that violate it.
Oh, also, if they violate their own observation, but you also don't meet the observation, it's a little bit weird. So like, I don't know, if both of you are like completely violating it, like neither of us can meet this observation, then you make this argument. If they have a case where like some of it meets and some of it doesn't meet, and none of your case meets the observation, then you should be also like, attacking the observation.
Yeah, like,
and not just saying that you don't meet it entirely.
yeah, what would be good is, yeah, if they like, and don't try and make those two arguments at the same time. Like, don't buy the observation, but also here's why they contradict themselves. If you're like in that scenario where if they win the observation, then you have nothing to weigh in your case, then just don't spend that time making that argument, because still at the end of the day, it's better for them. So if you're in that scenario, just like spend that time just making another argument about why this observation is terrible and the judge shouldn't buy it. Yeah, and then look at what burdens they're setting, which we already talked about. A lot of times they can be really abusive and only on one side. And if you point that out or explain how this burden also applies to their side, you can leverage that against their case. Okay, these are things we've already talked about, like defend the resolution as a general principle, not like one hyper-specific area. Explain why the logic is flawed and call them out for being abusive. Like, if observations like insanely skew the literature towards one side, that can make it much harder to defend the resolution. And you can also talk about like the terrible burdens they said. So it's kind of the same thing as like definitions. Almost like look at how this is defining the round and what kind of ground it sets for both sides, because fairness is something that you should look at and like what ground this gives to both sides to argue. Okay, we're going to look at some examples of past observations, because when I first started out on debate, I had no clue what observations were until I ran into one in round. I didn't know how to respond to it, and the only way I got better was by looking at them. So we're going to look at some. We're going to analyze what burdens it's saying, how it functions in the round. So the first one is resolved violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. the AF got up there and read an observation that says the affirmative doesn't need to defend all instances of violent revolution or even the majority of cases, but rather they just need to show it's like a just option, or in cases it can be a justified tool in the toolbox. So what this did is it preempted negatives arguments that said like violent revolution isn't successful because you're still making the argument that it's a justified tool for the oppressed to use. And then also it set the ground for him to make a principled case for why even if revolution isn't in the majority of cases preferable, it's a just response that people can act out on.
Tool in the toolbox is actually like one of the most common
Yeah.
observations you guys will probably encounter.
Yeah. Another one, the neg read, was violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. And the negative got up there and read that like 16th and 17th century philosophy about violent revolution is outdated because it doesn't take into account like modern weaponry or how the countries today respond to revolutionary groups. So like just what they say about it just isn't true anymore. And what that did is that preempts any deontological standpoint from social contract theorists or philosophers that talk about revolution and when it's justified or how revolution should be carried out, because it's not looking at the modern day scenarios. We've already talked about this. Oh wait, yeah, that's the one about like one avenue to achieve social justice, then they win. And we've already addressed like what burdens are set, how you rebut them. Yeah. Okay, so this one. So this one was for the radicalism topic, and basically what it says is because the resolution specifies which is preferable to achieve social justice, it's not enough to show that radicalism or incrementalism is preferable in theory, but that it actually makes gains at achieving social justice in the real world. So what this means is you're basically forcing a consequentialist framing onto your opponent because you're saying it's not enough to just show that like radicalism or incrementalism is good in theory or it's justified, but that it actually achieves social justice and makes a change for people, which is consequential. We can skip over that one. Yeah, don't worry about it. It was last topic. It is, yeah. It is. So an example that you could run for like this topic as an observation, you could say that like prioritize does not mean fully ignoring one in favor of the other, but rather when they come into conflict, one takes precedence over the other in the majority of instances. So like as a general like policy prescription over the years, China might prefer economic growth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to completely shirk economic protection. Like in the majority of cases, it'll prefer economic growth, but it'll still have some cases, environmental protection will take precedent. And then like one, and this one I feel like might be kind of abusive, is prioritize, is like the word prioritize in the resolution is discussing what is most necessary under the current status quo, and we're talking about what China should prioritize right now. So it's not addressing if that policy prescription would have to shift in the future due to a change in circumstances. So that's kind of preempting arguments that we talked about before with the recession, when China had to shift its goals to economic growth. You could say right now, China isn't in a recession or it's coming out of the COVID recession, and so it should prefer protecting the environment. If they go into a recession in the future, sure, they could prefer economic growth then, but that's not right now, and that's not what we're talking about, because we're talking about the status quo.
Another interesting observation I think you could think about is on either side, it's kind of fuzzy where this debate happens. That is, AF can make the argument that climate change like precludes economic growth, or is a necessary condition for it. Neg can make the argument that we need economic growth to make climate innovation. These are like kind of weird arguments because it's a little bit unclear whether it is affirmative or negative ground exactly to run those arguments. It probably leans one way, but if I'm affirmative and I'm suspecting that negative is going to be like, oh, well, we're better for the climate because the economy will get like climate innovation, you could be like, okay, maybe this is actually affirmative ground, because say we had a world where we cut back on everything else, like literally every other thing that's happening in the economy, and we only invest in climate innovation. That is like doing the AF, because this is like prioritizing climate or like environmental protection or whatever.
Mhm.
So maybe that's an observation you can make to like try to trick out of that argument. You can also respond to that in different ways if you're negative. And then, yeah.
I think an observation negative could run that's kind of in the same vein is, and this was something that they ran at nationals too because it was talking about radicalism being preferable to incrementalism. And so the affirmative needs to defend that China should prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. So for Candy, what are two routes the negative can make for this? For like prioritization. Like basically what I'm saying is, okay, I'll ask it this way. Does the negative need to defend that China should prioritize economic growth over environmental protection? Duer? Okay, why?
Because it's just the resolution is just asking us if we're negating the resolution, that just means we're not putting environmental protections on top. They can be both equal. They can both equally be there, and it doesn't mean that you have to cut back on environmental protections.
Yeah, like negative could make an argument that prioritizing economic growth and environmental protection at the same time is what's most effective, and then they can like point to examples of where economic growth benefits protecting the environment for prioritizing them at the same time. And so that can like kind of, I feel like you can make a sound argument for that, and so think about that and like how do you potentially respond to it.
This is also true of a lot of topics. Like
Yeah.
usually the AF will be the one like doing something, and the neg is the one not doing that thing. Not doing it does not mean you're doing the opposite thing.
Mhm.
If that makes sense. So you're not necessarily deprioritizing or prioritizing economic growth over environmental protection. That could be your negative, but negative has options in determining what not prioritizing means.
Yeah.
That kind of goes back to like how AF has fiat in terms of the resolution. You kind of assume that the resolution happens, which means that the AF will looks different than the neg will.
Yeah.
And neg tends to be the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
Which would you say is like stronger, just proving that like they shouldn't prioritize environmental protection, or also preferring that like economic growth would be better?
I think it like either
Yeah.
gives you like either one has pretty decent ground.
Yeah.
It also like I think the one that the prioritizing both is susceptible to is because then you have to be making arguments that's like trying to reduce climate change is good if that's the reason, because like otherwise you wouldn't want to prioritize environmental protection whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So then you're kind of conceding to a lot of the basis of the app's case. So then it becomes a question of whether or not this is your ground to begin with. So it might become a little bit fishy if you run that versus taking like the hardline stance that no, we should just do economic growth. But also if you do we should just do economic growth, then you like lose out on gaining a lot of that offense from like the huge impacts of climate change.
Yeah. Another thing it can run into the issue of is like the observation does concede that environmental protection is good. If you run into an affirmative that kind of Catherine recommended of a deontological like environmental rights, and so we should like seek to maximize protecting the environment at every point possible, that runs into that like beats the observation because it says no, prioritizing both isn't good. Any step towards protecting the environment is a good thing, which means we can't equally prioritize these.
Real.
Yep. Okay. I think that's the last slide if you want to check. Yeah. Okay.
Now we are in our
we touted it as brainstorm for the next 20 minutes. You can go ahead.
honestly, like okay, you guys have a lot of case writing time.
Yes.
Later, if you want to play a game right now, that would be
Yeah. That's what I think.
As like a little break.
Yeah. Because we just went like yeah.
Do you want to explain the cricket, or is it going to stay a secret?
Mr.
Chat the frog soon as a
Would you feel offended if they told you why and then hear about hypothesize that you're a cricket?
I would like to hear.
I'm really curious.
Sure.
Okay, so when I was walking behind you, I noticed that the back of your mullet hairdo thing had like little, well, your little hairdo. It has like two little curls at the end that like flicker in the wind like cricket antenna.
It was very funny to watch.
It was very charming, yeah. And then Catherine came subsequently as frog.
Why
Oh, it's-
frog?
Oh, is it because she eats the cricket?
No, it's the eternal battle. You guys
What?
are always fighting. For no reason
Oh.
or another.
Wait, but then
What?
when
What?
will the cricket win?
Yeah.
No,
When
wait.
it gets a parasitic infection and you subsequently get the
Oh.
infection.
It's like you're going down with me.
Yes.
What am I?
The air.
I'm the air.
The light.
I'm
Make you a cloud or
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Is there a game we want to play? It doesn't have to be debate related.
No, it can just be whatever.
Can be.
I mean, drawing got me thinking to put
Right.
fiction
Yeah.
thing.
Do we want to play Pictionary?
Wait,
Okay.
how do we get like
For people who are like listening to this on the live stream or in the future, we're gonna be gone for like 15 minutes, and then we'll be back.
Yeah, we should have the stream.
Oh yeah, that actually is so smart.
So, okay. We'll be going over them, don't worry. Okay, so quality of life. So we're looking at values right now. So the thing that you find most valuable that we're trying to uphold. One you could potentially run is quality of life, which is basically just a standard of health, comfort, and happiness within a person or group. And for this one, it can like pretty easily be applied to both sides. Like you can talk about how environmental damage affects quality of life and harms people's well-being, and then you can also talk about quality of life for economic growth and how it leads to innovation, more material goods, and better infrastructure, healthcare, that type of thing. And we'll come up with responses for like the value and criterions we talk about later on. We're going to do some like practice of like, here's two different frameworks, how would they respond to each other? Another one you can talk about is societal well-being, and it's the well-being of society. It's pretty straightforward. So what exactly does it mean? The difference is that like with quality of life, it encompasses a lot of that, but also it's not just about like the overall happiness of the populace, but it's also about like stability and security and like the economic state of things that also play into like not just like people's interests, but also like the state and like what it thinks it needs to like preserve society.
Question?
Answer.
I'm-
Oh, sorry. I thought you were like asking a question. Okay. What do you want to wear?
Or like, I've seen people. Do we have to add the maximizing part, or do we not?
Okay. So
Your criteria. Okay, so this is your values.
Yeah.
Your values does not have an ing.
Yeah,
Or
like-
well-being is an ing, but like not an actual.
not a verb.
ing
Okay.
Yeah.
word. 'Cause the-
Jiren?
What?
Jiren.
That's not what a
Jiren?
gerund is.
No?
A gerund is like a descriptive verb.
Oh, opposite
running
of that.
The running man.
So the answer is no, because like whenever you're talking about like maximizing, respecting, upholding, achieving, whatever, like that's a verb that you're trying to enact, so it's a criterion.
Another thing is like that. I think where the confusion comes is that societal well-being can also be used as a criterion.
Yeah.
To have, like maximizing societal well-being.
Yeah.
But yeah, and this we're just talking about like,
Yeah. And then justice. So there's a couple different conceptions of justice. The first one I'm going to talk about is justice as fairness. So basically, are the benefits and burdens of society fairly distributed among the populace? And so, for example, is that harming the least well off in ways that like the rich and elite are able to avoid because of their like economic or political power would be seen as like unfair or unjust because it's disproportionately affecting these people. You can also talk about justice as dues, and basically this means people are due certain things from the actor in the resolution. So, and the AF or neg better upholds those dues and so shows that the actor in the resolution upholds this obligation to its people. So with that in mind, what obligations does China have to its people? Just throw stuff out. Yeah?
To keep the economy well, or keep the populace well.
Okay. Yeah. So to keep them well, to keep the economy well, why does it matter if the economy is good? Like why would the government, why are people expecting the economy to be good? What do they get from that?
To like to have more money and to not fall into things like poverty and.
Okay. So, a couple things is like people are, the idea is that people are, do certain things from the government, and it kind of ties into social contract theory. There are like basic rights that people are insured or entitled to that the government has to uphold. Yeah?
Like the government ought to uphold like the rights of the people and not violate them.
Yeah. Oh, pff, that was terrible. That was a terrible throw. That was right here. But yeah, so China has certain obligations to its people that it has to uphold. Next. So another one you can talk about is environmental justice. So this was an argument that someone ran against me at nationals, and I think it's like fairly easily applicable on this topic that you could run for like AF. And basically, environmental problems are a nexus point for all other or most of the other social injustices out there. For example, environmental injustices perpetuate poverty, homelessness, they lead to resource scarcity, and it can also cause conflict. There's stuff out there that shows like when there's resource scarcity, it leads to conflict in those regions because of it. And so addressing environmental problems, you can like look to other ways to solve poverty and homelessness and like lack of resources, but unless you try and ensure that environmental problems aren't perpetuated, then there's no way to like truly solve it or ensure it. Okay, so some strategies on responding to generic values. All values that people tend to run normally, they have some intrinsic good to them. So this means like obviously stuff like quality of life is good, societal well-being is good, human dignity is good. So something you could say is like if they're similar, then just tell a judge that you and opponent are upholding the same thing. So for example, you can look at quality of life and societal well-being. A lot of times those are the same things, or someone will run like a value of quality of life with a criterion of societal well-being. So you could like say that if our values are quality of life and societal well-being, we're essentially trying to uphold the same things. You can spend time in cross-examination asking them like through the value, what are you trying to uphold, or what things, like what impacts does this like value have? Okay, and so another way you can talk about it is you can say your value is more applicable to the resolution. A lot of times you're going to see words like the appropriation of outer space by private entities is unjust. And so it's specifically asking the question of was just or unjust. So it makes sense that your value in that case would be justice because it's more directly answering the resolution. You can also give qualifications that prefer your value over another, so like it's more nuanced. So for example, if someone's writing justice as dues, you can ask questions like what are people due, or if you're running like a value of human dignity, you can say why are people due certain things. And so like you're trying to get at the point that like there's some underlying value that encompasses justice that explains why people are due these things or why fairness is bad, or like why fairness is a good thing to uphold. So with that in mind, okay, so what are like generic things people are due that like everyone is due, like certain like rights-based concepts? Life? Okay. Who said that? Okay. Okay. So yeah, life is a clear one. Yeah. Okay, right to protest and organize. So, question. Does China owe people different things? For example, like if someone like resides in China, does China have a different obligation to them or more of an obligation to them than if they weren't a citizen of China? Anyone? Yeah?
Yes, because they've entered into a social contract with China.
Whoa, that's a great transition. Let's go to the next slide. That's fine. We already talked about that. Hey, social contract theory. Okay. So there's some criterions you can run that talk about social contract, and it talks about what people are due specifically from the government. And so what is social contract theory? I assume a lot of you are familiar with it, but we're going to go over it just as a refresher. So first of all, the concept of social contract has the state of nature. What exists before society was created? And so this is like the state that people lived in and experienced before society came about, and different social contract theorists have different ideas on what life was like then, what rights people had, and why people left the state of nature, and why people formed society. And so when the government forms, when society forms, that's when people enter into a social contract. So people can exit the state of nature to secure their rights, but in return, they give up certain liberties to the state. And once again, different social contract theorists, you'll see, have different interpretations of what kind of rights they give up, what the government owes you when you enter into that social contract, and what that agreement looks like. And so what are the implications of social contract theory? So basically, it means that the government has obligations to its citizens, and in order for that government to be legitimate, it needs to uphold those obligations. And one thing to understand is that there are responses to social contract theory that can say that sure, governments might have obligations to its citizens, but it also has prior obligations to everyone in the world to like respect their basic needs, respect their dignity. Just because they're not citizens doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with them. So there is debate on that about how it can function. A good value that's normally ran with social contract theory is government legitimacy. Justice works pretty well too because it's what people are due. And the idea of government legitimacy is that because the actor in the resolution is China, and China has entered into a social contract with its citizens, the most important thing for China to do is be legitimate in the eyes of its citizens and uphold the social contract that it has. Because if a government isn't legitimate and then it can't carry out any legitimate policy action, then it's not moral. So the first social contract theory we're going to look at is Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes said that the state of nature was a terrible place to live. Life was nasty, short, and brutish, and you would die quickly. And in order to secure their safety, people would enter into a social contract with the state to ensure their security. And so what are the duties of a Hobbesian conception of government? Basically, literally just make sure you don't die. Like, the main thing for Hobbes is like the security of the state and its people is the most important thing. He talks about rebellion not being good because it upsets the social order. And an interesting thing with this is Hobbes is anti-death penalty because it's the government taking away their citizens' like right to life, which is what they entered into the social contract for. So any like security-based arguments or arguments for why the government needs to be secure would fit under a Hobbesian framework, and you could run Hobbesian social contract theory for it. And so the security of the state is necessary to ensure the security of its people. And so basically there's a couple arguments that like justice only exists when a sovereign power exists within a civilized society. Like in the state of nature, there's no conception of justice. It's everyone for themselves, and only a government can ensure that justice is carried out or things like fairness can be ensured. Another example is why security is so important for the state, and it could be like the main thing that the state needs to ensure, is that risking security in favor of one civil liberty can put every other liberty at risk as well, and the lives of its citizens. This is the idea that a government would always prefer prioritizing security above certain rights, because if dealing away with security leads to the state collapsing or societal unrest, then the state isn't able to hold anyone's liberties or anyone's rights or anyone's life. And so security always comes first to ensure the state has its power it needs to uphold its obligations.
One thing with Hobbes that I'd recommend is that if the resolution outlines a specific state, like the United States, it might not be the best to run Hobbes as compared to when the resolution just outlines states.
Correct. Especially with like the United States is a really good example. Like it's not good to run Hobbes with the US because we literally have like a Bill of Rights that tells you what rights the government can't infringe on, and those definitely extend further than just like right to life. And so yeah, you should look at like as a general principle, or like not looking at specifically any one state, so it might not be good on this resolution. But in the future, when there's topics that are talking about what states ought to do, you can run social contract theory. Yeah. Let's go on to Locke. So Locke said the state of nature had ups and downs. He said that people were perfectly free to do as they wish in the state of nature. They had like full liberty and autonomy over themselves, but because of this, no one's rights were secure. So they agreed to give up some of their rights in exchange for preservation and security over their other liberties. And so what are the duties of a Lockean government? So, first thing is, like, don't be totalitarian. This is the difference between Hobbes and Locke specifically, among other things. Locke says that, like, Hobbes says that anyone who is able to, like, have the power to protect the life of the people is, like, a just government. Like, it has the power to do so. And Locke is more, like, pro-democracy, pro-rights, and pro-people having a say in the government and how it should function. And it says it has a duty to ensure life, liberty, and property of its people. That's really similar to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that's because, like, founding fathers drew upon Locke when they're framing that. And one thing that's important to know about Locke is that he openly justified economic inequalities. So it's like he said that, like, he was pro-free market and, like, capitalism, and he said that when, like, people agree to economic inequalities and their place within society on an economic scale when they enter society and engage with the free market. So, like, don't run inequality if you're also running Locke at the same time, because he just doesn't uphold it or agree to it. Locke can kind of work on both sides. Like, climate change clearly harms people's life, and also economic growth provides more opportunities and lifts people out of poverty, improving both life and liberty. There's more in-depth ways you can go about addressing it, but there's points where it can be both. One way you can respond to this is, does China act under, like, a Lockean perspective? Yeah, no. Like, and so, like, this is kind of the argument of, like, China maybe ought to act like a Lockean perspective, but there's other clear ways that they're going to violate the social contract and still not be a legitimate government, even if they're prioritizing economic protection or economic growth or environmental protection. So that's another thing, like, with specific instances of state actors, like, if your value is government legitimacy, your opponent can just point to other examples where the government is doing things that aren't legitimate, so it doesn't really matter. John Rawls. So Rawls is, like, the main modern social contract theorist, and he talked a lot about justice as fairness. So a really common framework that's run is a value of justice as fairness with a criterion of some of Rawls's concepts, which we'll get into. So one thing is he talked about ensuring equality of opportunity. People should have, like, access to the same opportunities to achieve the same things. He doesn't defend equality of outcomes necessarily. Another thing he talked about is ensuring that benefits go to the least advantaged members of society. And so one thing he talked about here, that's basically the difference principle, that the benefits in society should go to the least well-off. And the reason that's the case is something called the veil of ignorance. Okay, so let's say you're like taking an outside perspective. Okay, this is you, and then, like, this is a country. Okay. And so the argument is that people in a social contract make the decision to enter it, yeah, in an agreement with the government. So one issue with social contract is, did any of you agree to, like, be born in the United States? Did any of you agree to be born in the country you were? No. So, like, that's a criticism of social contract theory, and Rawls kind of addresses it by saying, okay, because that's the case, let's assume you're outside, like, any government and you're choosing which country you want to enter into a social contract with. Because you can't choose, like, what position you're born in society with, like, your economic power, like, yes, things like that, your, like, the distribution of resources, and it's a random chance. You could become the richest person in society, or you could be born into, like, the poorest people in society. Rawls would say that even if, like, on net, there's a country that has a lot of wealth and there's a lot of rich people, but there's massive inequality, where there's also a lot of people that are on the very lower end of the spectrum. And then there's another country where everyone's wealth is kind of in the middle, and everyone is, like, generally, like, middle class. Rawls would say that people would want to enter that society because with the roll of the dice, they're more secure and more likely to be better off than if they were born into the other country where there's massive inequality, where they might be on the lowest end of the spectrum. So that's why he says that we want to ensure benefits go to the least well off, because that's what people would want if they're choosing to enter the social contract, because they can't choose where they're born or what conditions they were born into. Does that kind of make sense? Are there any questions on that? Okay. Next slide. Okay, so like an argument you can make for affirmative withdrawals is that because economic growth doesn't inherently give the greatest benefit to the least well off, and environmental damage does harm the least well off and keep them like in the lowest rung of society, China ought to prefer protecting the environment over economic growth. Like that's a general thesis you can make for an affirmative case, because environmental damage disproportionately harms the least well off, and nothing about economic growth will inherently benefit the least well off. We ought to prefer prioritizing environmental protection, because while it might harm economic growth, it might not make the country as rich or as well off. It's going to decrease inequality and make the country more equitable.
A question.
Yeah.
Would you say that the difference principle or the veil of ignorance is more applicable to this resolution?
I'd say okay, so I'm a big fan of not running the criterion of a veil of ignorance, just because there's like no way to measure it. You're saying that like people choose it's just like a thought experiment he used to justify his theory. So I'd say veil of ignorance is something you can reference, but difference principle is definitely more applicable on this topic, I'd say.
Do you think it's fine if you just run like raw social contract in general? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times people run like Rawls's theory of justice as their criterion.
Veil of ignorance is not a criteria. You're not
Yeah.
doing it. It's like a justification for your criteria.
Exactly. Like, yeah, like you can say like my criterion is like Rawls's difference principle, subpoint A, like veil of ignorance, and then just talk about it. I don't know. But yeah, like don't run a criterion of the veil of ignorance, because it's super vague. Like it's not a weighing mechanism. Like it doesn't tell you why people choose to enter it. It just says people look outside, like people know like it's up to a roll of the dice how their position is going to be. Like it's a way to justify the difference principle. It's not like your standard of weighing. So that's social contract theory. Another criterion you can run is called respecting others as ends. And so basically what this means is that people should be treated as ends in themselves. And what exactly does that mean? So basically if you use people as a means, that means you're using them to gain some type of benefit for you, and you're basically using them as a tool. And that's bad because it violates their dignity, because we're all rational beings with autonomy. And when you're forcing someone to do something for you that'll benefit that'll benefit you and not help them or harm them, then you're infringing upon their autonomy. And so that's basically saying using people to achieve an end goal is immoral. An example that's used often is like kidnappers using their hostage to gain money. So the means are the people being held hostage, and their end goal is like gain profit, gain money. There's no inherent benefit to the people that they're using, and it's violating their autonomy. One thing is that it's okay to treat people as a means if they're also the end goal. So if you're using people to gain some type of end goal, that can be seen as justified if, like, one, they consent to it, and also the end goal is going to somehow benefit them. We talked about, this is super deontological, and it's like saying the rules of like not violating autonomy, like your intent when you're making an action. So it might not be super applicable on this topic, but for future reference, it's something you can pull up. So it's okay to treat people as a means if they're also an end. An example of this is why stealing from someone is immoral, but taxes aren't, because taxes do go to generally help society, or they're used for social benefits that help those people. So they're the end goal in themselves. Question. I kind of already specified this, but is it okay to use someone as an end if they consent? So I've already addressed it, yeah?
I would say yes, but I do think within certain conditions you could argue no if they're like kind of like what we talked about with like people being underpaid and in bad condition.
Yeah.
Like content with it.
Yeah. And so question then, why is it and we can get into that later about like why exploitation is like inherently unjust, and a lot of times, especially with like workers, it isn't necessarily them making an autonomous decision because there's still like coercion in the process, like work for me or you die. Where else are you going to go to get money and pay for food? So yeah, it's okay to use someone as an end, as a means if they consent to it. Can someone tell me why it's okay in that instance? Okay, so what's the problem with using people as a means? It violates their autonomy. Okay, so if someone is consenting to be used as a means, or is their autonomy being violated? Right, they're making that conscious decision to do that, so it's not immoral. So this is like an example of forced military conscription versus military volunteers. Like you could definitely still argue that like militaries in general or militarization is a bad thing, but in the concept of like military populace using people as a means, it's not so much using them as a means if they consent to join the military force, because you're not forcing them or stripping them of their autonomy. They're making that decision for themselves. Okay. Another one you can run is resisting / minimizing oppression. So basically, oppression occurs when a group is defined as an outgroup that's undeserving of fairness or resources. And this can lead to, and a really strong argument that can be made for oppression frameworks is when people are defined as an outgroup and they're deemed as not deserving of resources, then they're morally excluded from other frameworks. So an example that can be used is if you see people that like aren't deserving of dues or aren't deserving of fairness, then they can't access justice. And so minimizing oppression and ensuring people are considered in moral frameworks is like a prerequisite to other frameworks. I didn't run this as much as Catherine did. Is there anything you want to like specifically say on it, or like the justifications for it?
Oh, minimizing. Oh, I love this framework.
Yeah.
I ran this on every topic on every side. Okay, what do we have? What did you say for?
Basically just like quoting Ofrenio.
Okay, I think that this is like a very strong argument, or a very strong framework, because on a lot of frameworks you have two types of arguments you can make, which is like, one, this framework is bad, like it actually causes bad things to happen, and two, maybe there's something like wrong with this framework that it does not include. You can only make the second type of argument against minimizing oppression, because if you get up there and you're like, wait, oppression is, we should not minimize oppression, like that just sounds really bad. So versus things like consequentialism generally, you can make like indicts of it without, because like consequentialism is not something that is always necessarily good. So you can't make arguments that minimizing oppression is bad, but you can only make arguments that minimizing oppression is not the best way to do something, if that makes sense. What other thoughts do I have on this?
What's the difference between resisting and minimizing oppression?
Honestly, I said resisting oppression, and I did consequentialism a lot. So I guess I don't know. It's kind of up to you. Minimizing is necessarily consequential, I think, because you're like actually trying to reduce something in the world. I think resisting oppression could also lend you to a deontological framework, and I also think that you can like mix things in your case if you are running a like saying resisting oppression or resisting something, in the sense that like your case does not have to be entirely deontological or consequential, because you can have a top level argument that is like I think like violent revolution is the best example, or like the radicalism topic that you just had. That's like, it is just good for people to, it is like inherently good for people to protest using any means they can, because all of it is a form of self-defense, like against the state, for example. That can be like one contention, and that is resisting oppression in a deontological way, because like maybe it kills a bunch of people in the process, I don't know. It doesn't matter because we still care about it. And that's like my first contention. Contentions 2 and 3 though could be talking about why like radicalism or why violent revolution it creates good outcomes, and the reasons why both of those can fit under that framework is because I haven't specified that I am like completely means-based or completely ends-based. So then the question becomes, wait a minute, if you're running both, how do you order those? The ordering is that the deontological argument always comes first. That is, if you win that argument, it's like a if you win that self-defense is innately good, and you should never violate it, then you win that argument and you win the round. If you lose that argument, you have consequential ground that you can still win on, but you would have to weigh that argument against your opponent, if that makes sense. Yes, other thoughts? I don't know. Is it Jagger?
What do you do with the consequentialist argument? So if you're running like a deontology on first and then like consequentialism second, if you win the first, like do you just kick the second argument or do you just win off of it? Like what does your judge think of that?
If you win it's like, okay, how do I explain this? It's like, if you win the first argument, it's not like you don't defend your second and third arguments. You can say that it is both principally good and it is also good in practice. If it is, okay, imagine it like this. We're making two arguments here, deont and consequentialism, and we're gonna do if deont yes, we win. Okay, we win. If deont no, question mark? Because now it goes back to this. If I weigh better, then win. If no, sad. Okay, so the idea is it's kind of a path like this, where your deontological arguments are always first order arguments, in that if you win them, you win the round. If you are running both under a framework that supports both, like resisting oppression, then if you win your deontological contention, you like win. Because if you say that violations are always bad, then that's like top level argument. If you don't win it, that doesn't mean you lose, because you defend two things. You're defending that it's both principally deontologically good and that it's good consequentially. So if you don't win your first contention, now it becomes a debate about your second and third contentions versus whatever your opponent is saying. So if you weigh better than your opponent, you still win. If not, sad. So this is like the layering of those arguments. Does this kind of make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so like, and a lot of times too, it's like can be kind of hard to determine what arguments you're winning or losing on. Like sometimes you can tell, but other times it can be really close rounds. So the general idea is like don't kick any more offense than you need to normally. Like more offense, more voters is normally a good thing. But that said, don't give like 7 voters in your like final speech. Like crystallize it to like the main things you're winning on.
Another thing is like, even though this is like, I think like philosophically true, like technically true, it also depends on how you explain this to your judge. You cannot just go up there in your 2AR and you're like, I won my first contention because you violate self-defense, that's an auto win for me. Like you have to explain why this comes first, because even though like we explained that to you when we talked about like deontology versus consequentialism, you still need to do that work for your judge. So you still spend time explaining why if you win this argument, your other arguments don't matter. We'll also talk about whenever we talk about the 2AR, I don't know when we talk about that, or voters, Tuesday, yes, Tuesday. Whenever we talk about voters, we're gonna talk about like, basically like nested like even if statements, where it's like, so if I spend 1 minute talking about, okay, I won this argument, this is the first order thing in the round, like there's literally no way for my opponent to win at this point, but like, let's say I just didn't defend this enough for like whatever reason, and you tell that to your judge, you're like, okay, but pretend my opponent had actual arguments against this even though they didn't, I still win under a consequentialist interpretation. So judge looks to this first. If they buy it, you win. If they don't buy it, they look to this, and if, like so on and so forth. So the idea that you have like several layers of offense that are in order of priority gives you a lot more ground in the round if you are finding ways to win on the top layer and then the next top layer and so on and so forth.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Sorry, so yesterday you talked about how you should place your strongest argument in the third contingent slot. Does that come into conflict with like putting deontology first?
I think it actually makes sense to, if you're gonna run like a mixed case, you should probably put the deontological argument first, just because it's like because it's on like a different level than your other arguments.
Okay.
Versus like if you had all consequential impacts, then they're all on the same like level philosophically, so then they can go in the order we talked about, where you put your strongest argument last.
Okay. So yeah, we've kind of already talked about it. Focusing on oppressed groups takes priority in any moral framework. For examples, Rawls would likely agree on this when looking to the least well off. And if justice is about giving people their due, the oppressed groups are the ones that are lacking in what they are due, and the government is, and they are the ones that the government isn't fulfilling their obligations to. So when we're looking at justice as dues, we need to look at the ones who are being deprived of their dues.
Wait, go back a second. How would you answer this framework if someone was like, my criterion is minimizing oppression or resisting oppression? Anyone?
We'll have some. No, go ahead.
Okay, so I think this applies more to resisting oppression. I think a common argument is that this places the burden on communities that are already struggling. So when you prioritize resisting oppression, you're not specifying any factors doing it, so that burden automatically falls on communities that are vulnerable. But I don't know, that's just something I heard, I think. So.
Yeah.
So I guess you could argue that you help the oppressed people, and then you do whatever yours is. So like if you're valuing or you're doing something, and then you can say like, oh yeah, I do this extra whatever, and I do what you're doing like better.
Yeah.
So, like,
So if you're running like straight up consequentialism or utilitarianism, like a lot of people are like, you simply do not minimize oppression at all. Like that's probably not true. Like if you're aggregating all consequences, you definitely consider minimizing oppression. So maybe there's some argument you can make about how it's better to not always prioritize the oppressed. Maybe there's some instances in which you ought to prioritize the good of everyone instead. I also think there's some lack of specificity here in that if I'm trying to resist oppression, it doesn't tell me like okay, there are examples of instances in which the means by which you resist oppression can be like a little bit ethically dubious. Like if like the Tamil Tigers like use child soldiers in their like liberation efforts, like maybe that's like a little weird. So maybe we shouldn't excuse like every single act that tries to resist oppression, because even if you are trying to do so, you may be contributing to some like evil or some wrong that is also bad. This also just doesn't specify a group either or a specific type of oppression you're resisting. So it's basically like mini consequentialism, where you focus the round into types of oppression and then you can talk about different things. So maybe you want more specificity in your framework. Like you could talk about, I don't know, like minimizing reducing capitalism, resisting capitalism on this topic. Or on other topics, you can talk about militarism or like racial violence, stuff like that. And you can specify why these types of violence are more like the root cause of other types of violence, and then you can make those arguments.
Like during January and February, the majority of the topics are either about immigration or like United States policy towards indigenous tribes, where like resisting oppression would probably be a really good framework to run. Okay. Lastly is util. I'm not gonna go over this a lot because it's basically generic consequentialism. It's like aggregate all the cost benefits, see which one is best. One thing is that there's some justifications for it that people run, and one of them is that util is the only way that government actors like view policymaking. But we've already addressed like how sometimes this isn't necessarily true. Like there are side constraints like Bill of Rights or stuff where even if enacting a policy would increase societal well-being or whatever, if it violates people's like fundamental rights guaranteed with them, then it's still immoral and we still can't do it.
I have a question for like students. How do you measure pain or pleasure?
I mean, like, it's dependent, but in certain cases, I think there's, like, obvious ones, like, making more money would obviously be, like, a pleasure, and being in poverty would obviously be a pain.
Okay, and with that, another question: do people get like pleasure and pain from the same things? Yeah. So that's another thing, is that like pleasure and pain is really vague as a weighing standard, and a lot of times it's hard to aggregate what pleasure and pain is or how people are going to experience it, because it's different for different people.
So if you run
Yeah.
like a response to util that like you don't know what pleasure and pain mean to you don't know what that means to like each specific person, and you also don't know how to accurately measure those things.
I think there's also another argument. Okay, the response to that is to just be like, that's like low-key not true. Like things like having a house to live in are probably pleasurable to everyone. Like we're not counting fringe cases where people like don't want to be housed forever. Like this is like a 99% thing. And usually you can rely on intuition to do this. Like even if you can't justify exactly why every person would enjoy having a house, like things become infinitely regressive after a point, because like if you keep asking why questions like a little fifth grader, like that like eventually you get nowhere. So there's some point at which we have to rely on what we generally think is true of the world. So people are happy when they have money to buy like basic materials to survive. People are happy when they are respected. People are happy at like in these other instances. So there are some responses though that you will hear that are like, which types of happiness matter more, even if we can determine what produces happiness. So consequentialism or like generic utilitarianism can be vague in that way because it doesn't actually give you a metric. Even like the metric is that like you basically just debate case, but the idea is that it doesn't tell you what to prioritize. So those become arguments that you have to make in the debate, but the framework doesn't necessarily tell you how to do that.
Okay. Okay. So one thing that's important is don't mix up deontological values with a consequentialist criterion. So, for example, if someone got up and said, "I value human dignity. My criterion is utilitarianism," why could this be a problem? Jack?
Human dignity is an inherently deontological value when you're looking at what somebody is due, when you're looking at or how to respect their fundamental humanity. Utilitarianism is the basis of consequentialism. They're just two inherently different.
Yeah, so
Why can't I respect dignity by doing actions that produce good outcomes for that person?
Because it's not necessarily with utilitarianism, it's not necessarily the dignity of one individual human so much as the collective outcome of a whole bunch of humans. You're not valuing their dignity, you're just valuing how well off their life is as compared to as it was yesterday.
What if I said dignity, like this action would be a dignity recognizing thing? Like me giving you a house to live in is also me signaling to you that I think that you ought to have a house to live in. Anyone have thoughts?
I guess it's kind of broad. So if you're using like a deontology philosopher, you're gonna kind of have like a specific way of how you're achieving it. But with consequentialism, you could get that dignity through like literally anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're like getting like potential dignity.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Thoughts on this? Like, yeah.
Like the aggregate aspect of consequentialism can also be
Yeah.
a bit problematic for human dignity because when dignity conflicts for two people, then what would you do?
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, is that because util is about aggregating the like costs and benefits or something, it would just like it could in theory justify like maximizing dignity for a certain group of people, even if it meant minimization of dignity for another group of people. The issue is when you think about what deontology is, it's about specific rules and like moral absolutes. And if everyone is due human dignity, violating that in any instance is immoral. Okay. Responding to util, we already went over this. One of this was, do people like do people like always think consequentially? Like, do they always think about like the costs and benefits, and is that the only thing they look at? Okay, so let's look at an example like the trolley problem, for example. Like, let's say through util you would pull the lever, kill one person to save 5. What if that like one person was a close friend or a member of your family? Yeah, and so the issue is that sometimes like it basically is just like not how people act in the real world. The issue with an argument like that is it doesn't really matter if it's how we act, it's well how we ought to act. So you can still say like, yeah, but like in society's terms in general, this is what we should do. And there are arguments that say stuff, and then there are other arguments that say stuff like we need to look at addressing the means first, or looking at the means by which we achieve things, because our strategies on how we achieve a goal also shape that end goal. An example of this is violent revolution again. Something that was ran a lot is when we're looking at the means by which revolution occurs, if violent revolutions are more likely to result in oppressive states compared to non-violent revolutions. So what that means is we need to look at the means by which we try and like overthrow a government, or the means by which we act, because it can also result in like it can also determine what results in the end state.
Going back to the like thing about how not everyone thinks consequentially all the time. Another example of this is like promises.
Yeah.
Like you don't necessarily keep a promise to like a friend because of the benefit it gives to you. It's for like the sake of it being a promise.
Okay. Okay. Question: how could you respond to util if you're also running a consequentialist framework? Ideas?
I guess you're better or they're too broad. So like if you're specific enough, you can just be like.
Yeah. Oh, I missed that. But yeah, no, that's exactly right. So there's two responses you can make. First of all, if like your criterion also isn't super specific, then just default to util Wayne. But if you are specific, then you should do exactly what was just said, like explain why your specificity is good and why it should be preferred over general consequential benefits. So like, for example, if their criterion is utilitarianism and your criterion is security or maximizing security, not necessarily on this topic, although you maybe could, you should explain why maximizing security takes priority over other consequential benefits in other sectors. General strategy. So usually the more specific your framework is, the more specific your arguments should be. Like, that's the whole thing, like maximizing security, you should focus on how the resolution would affect security, and then if you're just doing generic utilitarianism, you can look at a broad range of impacts. Also be careful, because if you're running a specific philosopher, you may contradict yourself. So if you're like running Rawls or running Locke, you should actually read what they say so you know what you're talking about. So for example, if my value of justice defined by Rawls as fairness and my criterion is utilitarianism, this has been ran before, and yeah. No, it's totally fine. It allows you to access more impacts. Yeah, it kind of depends on like what the resolution is and how you can justify specificity.
Also, I think a lot of the debates come down to like your specificity is usually better because what you are doing specifically is like has a root cause claim, whereas like poverty or security is the only reason why we can get other impacts. So the response to that is usually like, no, because here's another thing that also it has a root cause claim. So like literally just name one other thing, or be like everything is contingent on everything else. So like you should just like aggregate all things in society.
So I also have a question. Oh, I think it might be answered.
Yeah. So this conception of justice isn't compatible with util because Rawls specifically like wrote his book, A Theory of Justice, as a response to utilitarianism. So like when you're running a criterion of util along with it, you're like inherently contradicting your framework.
I think this is true for like contradicting philosophies. If your philosopher said a certain policy is bad, okay, this happened to me once. Someone ran Rawls against me, I conceded it. I said I meet this, and then in the next rebuttal, they literally read Rawls and was just like, Rawls quite literally said that this exact policy is bad, and I was like, Rawls interpreted his own theory incorrectly. Like you can make arguments that are like the way in which a philosopher interpreted their own theory. You can contest those, but you can accept the theory being true.
That is also really good responses, because if you cite really old philosophers, a lot of times they're going to have really problematic views, and you can like make that exact argument that just because the philosopher had like prejudice, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't use their philosophy for good or in a better way.
And, like, I believe sometimes you can also argue how it's like non-applicable, like how John Locke didn't talk about alien space property.
Yeah, like sometimes it's hard to like. It's like hard to apply theories from like way back then to now in like a easy or like direct way.
Also, it seems like a lot of work to actually know about philosophers. The good thing about old philosophers is that other people have written about those philosophers. So instead of writing what they wrote in 1600, you could read like an article that someone else wrote in language that is like 5-letter words. Okay, maybe not 5, like 8-letter words. And you can use that as your evidence instead of citing the literal philosopher, because there are interpretations of like past philosophy as well.
Also, a lot of times that's really nice because they wrote it in like today English and not 16th century English. So it's like easier for you, your judge, your opponent to understand. Okay, and then the last thing is that like always think through when like you have your framework and then you're writing your contentions, like think through and understand why every contention, why every subpoint applies to your framework. Because if your criterion is like minimizing the oppression, and then your contention 1 is about like economic growth is minimizing inequalities, like benefits go to the least well off, and then your first contention is about like economic growth like builds prosperity, and you never link it back to inequality, then there's no reason to prefer that contention. Okay. For the last like 2 minutes, we're gonna do like quick practices, so no worries. Another one. Okay, so value of justice criterion of Locke's social contract. How would that respond to a value of justice and a criterion of minimizing oppression? Yeah.
I would say that Locke's social contract more specifically talks about like what a government or a state ought to do and ought to offer its citizens, instead of just saying that people should resist oppression.
Yeah, like specifically social contract theory like is more specific because it talks about the obligations that a government has to its people, which you can use if the resolution is about government actors. How would minimizing oppression respond to Locke? Jack?
Minimizing oppression helps people who are excluded from the system achieve justice, so therefore they can be considered in valuations of justice.
Okay. Is there anything I talked about where Locke might actually justify some types of oppression?
Locke justifies income inequalities and income inequalities.
Yeah, exactly. Nice.
As a social contract.
Mm-hmm. And then, okay, we're going to do one more just because we're running short on time. So, let's go, like, I think it's 2 slides. Yeah. Another one. Okay. So, value of human dignity, criterion of util, value of quality of life, criterion of maximizing expected well-being. So, let's say you're the human dignity util. They come at you and say, this literally can't function together and doesn't make any sense. And your contentions are talking about like maximizing utility and like the benefits of it. What could you do?
I guess you could say you achieve like the most overall human dignity, so it's better like overall.
Okay. So another thing you could do also, here you go, is your contentions apply to utility and maximizing utility. And so arguably they could fit under this framework, right? So you could like literally get up there, say, like, kick my framework, let's look at this through my opponents. So that's like an example.
Yeah, just because people say different words than you does not mean that you have to be really like antagonistic towards them.
Yeah.
If I'm running util and they run maximizing expected well-being, which which is the same thing but longer, I'm not going to go up there and be like, well, utilitarianism is better than maximizing well-being because because of my evidence that I read here about why utilitarianism is
Yeah.
better. Like, you should listen to what they are saying the criterion does and evaluate whether or not it's a battle that you want to fight. If
Yeah.
you think that you need to win the framework, or you should win the framework to give you a better chance of winning the round, then keep going for it. If you don't, if you can think they're like literally the same like this, or if they're similar enough where you can impact out your arguments to fit under theirs, then you should do that.
Yeah, like not every framework debate needs to be a fight to the death, mine over yours. Like you can concede into theirs, you can explain why yours are literally the same, and so here are like the general impacts you should be looking at in the round.
Just, like, can you kick on the app? Like,
Yeah.
can you give your own framework?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's like when you should kick normally.
Oh, okay.
Just because of the time constraint. There, like you can do it under neg, but normally what negative does on framework is if you're listening to the affirmative speech and it sounds like your impacts fit under AF, then you can just like in your constructive speech say, I concede to my opponent's value and criterion of human dignity, util. So that's how we'll look it through the round. Here's my contention. Yeah.
Wait, so I'm kind of confused. So you say that instead of saying your value and framework, or do you continue saying it in your case right now?
No,
Just,
like
don't even read it.
yeah, like
You're negative.
like it.
You're just I concede.
Yeah, no, not like I concede the round. Like I concede I concede to my opponent's framework. So like,
So okay.
yeah, so like you agree that their framework is how we should look through the round.
Imagine you're like neg, you read your definitions, then you say, I agree with the value of, I agree with the criterion of, or you can just say, I concede to the opponent's framework. Either way, but you still like mention the framework. You don't just like
Yeah.
go straight to the contention.
Yeah, like specify to your judge that like you agree with the
Like-
framework. That's how you'll view it.
Yeah.
So they know you're not like.
Just not
Just
running
not-
one.
just
Yeah.
don't
This
have a
wasn't
framework.
you didn't even think about your case. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's also strategic to concede framework on negative if you want to, because then you have like so much more time to play a bunch of responses on the I don't know.
Yeah.
That's the presumed Corel strategy.
Yeah.
Okay. So now that's general like frameworks. All this will be posted on Classroom, so if anything piqued your interest, you can look at it later, and also understand that this is definitely not the end all be all to values and criterions or observations. So like the next hour is just going to be spent working on cases. We're gonna head over